You've been carrying a weight that no one can see, not just from life, not just from problems, but from being away from yourself. And maybe that is why everything feels heavier than it should. Even the simple things, even the quiet moments. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix, a kind of pressure that follows you everywhere. And the truth is, it is not life that is making you feel this way. It is the distance between you and your own self. When you return to yourself, something begins to change, not outside, but within. The noise starts to soften, the tension slowly releases. The constant need to hold everything together begins to fade, and what once felt heavy starts to feel lighter, not because your life suddenly became perfect, but because you are no longer fighting against it. Buddhist wisdom has shown this for centuries. The more you resist, the heavier life becomes, and the more you return to simple awareness, the lighter everything feels. Tonight, as you listen, something will begin to shift. Your mind will slow down, your body will soften. The weight you have been carrying will start to lift, and you will begin to feel a quiet kind of relief, the kind that does not depend on fixing anything, the kind that comes from finally resting in yourself again. This is not just something to listen to before sleep. This is a return to the place where nothing was ever missing, where life no longer feels so heavy. Are you ready? Let's begin. And as that quiet begins to settle within you, something deeper starts to reveal itself. Beneath the noise, beneath the constant tension, there is a subtle truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is uncomfortable to face. The weight you feel is not only coming from what you carry, it is also coming from who you believe you have to be while carrying it. There is a quiet exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you do, and everything to do with how much you pretend. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not show up as obvious pain. It hides in small moments, in the way your shoulders tighten when you speak, in the way your words are slightly edited before they leave your mouth, in the way you adjust yourself depending on who is in front of you. It is subtle but constant, and over time it becomes heavy. There is a strange kind of tiredness that comes from holding yourself together in a way that is not natural. It feels like you are always on, always maintaining something, always aware of how you are being seen. Even when you are alone, there is still a sense that you are performing, as if an invisible audience is watching. This is the quiet exhaustion of pretending. It begins very early, often without being noticed. As children, there is a natural way of being, open, curious, unfiltered. But slowly, expectations begin to shape behavior. Be this, don't be that. Act like this, hide that part. And over time, a pattern forms. Certain parts of you are allowed, others are pushed away. What remains is not false in a dramatic sense, but it is incomplete. The problem is not that you have learned how to function in the world. The problem is that you begin to believe that the version of you that fits expectations is the real you. And once that belief settles in, maintaining it becomes a full-time effort. You begin to carry identities like armor, the strong one, the calm one, the successful one, the one who has everything figured out. Each identity has its own rules, its own boundaries, its own limitations, and to keep it intact, energy is constantly used. Even something as simple as a conversation can become tiring, not because of the words, but because of the constant adjustment behind them. Should I say this? Should I hold back? Will this change how they see me? The mind moves quickly, filtering, shaping, controlling. This happens so fast that it feels normal, but the body knows. The body feels the tension, the slight tightness in the chest, the shallow breath, the subtle fatigue that appears even after doing very little. This is not physical exhaustion. It is the weight of maintaining something that is not fully aligned. And here is where the shift begins, not by forcing yourself to be different, not by rejecting everything you have learned, but by noticing. Simply noticing when there is effort. Not the effort of doing something meaningful, but the effort of being someone. There is a difference. Doing requires energy. But being in its natural state does not. When you are not pretending, there is a sense of ease. Words come without calculation. Actions flow without internal resistance. There is less thinking about how things should appear and more presence in how things actually are. This does not mean everything becomes perfect. It means everything becomes lighter because you are no longer carrying the extra layer. The teachings of Buddhism often point to this in a very simple way. They do not focus on creating a better version of yourself. They focus on seeing clearly, seeing how the mind creates identities and how those identities create tension. The moment you see this clearly, something loosens. You begin to realize that much of the weight you feel is not coming from life itself, but from the constant effort to maintain a certain image within it. And once that is seen, even slightly, there is space. Space to pause before reacting, space to speak without editing, space to feel without immediately trying to change the feeling. This space is small at first, almost unnoticeable, but it grows. And in that space, something else appears. A kind of quiet honesty, not the kind that needs to be announced, but the kind that is simply present. You stop trying to convince others of who you are, and instead you begin to rest in what is already there. This can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because the mind is used to structure, to identity, to certainty. Without it, there can be a sense of not knowing. But this not knowing is not a problem. It is openness. And openness is light. Think about how much energy is spent trying to control perception, trying to be understood, trying to avoid judgment. It is endless, and no matter how much effort is used, it is never fully successful, because people will always see things through their own lens. When you begin to see this, something shifts again. You realize that the effort to control how you are seen is not only exhausting, it is unnecessary. And when that effort drops, even slightly, there is relief. You no longer have to carry the burden of being consistent with an image. You no longer have to defend an identity. You no longer have to explain yourself in ways that distort your experience just to fit expectations. There is freedom in that, not a loud, dramatic freedom, but a quiet one. The kind that feels like breathing more deeply without trying. The kind that feels like sitting without tension in your body. This is what it means to abandon false identities, not to destroy anything, but to stop holding on to what is not needed. And as that holding loosens, the psychological weight begins to lift. You may notice that situations that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable. Not because they have changed, but because you are not adding extra pressure on top of them. You may notice that interactions feel less draining, not because people are different, but because you are no longer carrying the need to perform within them. You may notice that your thoughts become quieter, not because you have forced them to stop, but because there is less resistance, less tension feeding them. Everything becomes simpler. And simplicity is light. There is also a deeper layer to this. When you stop pretending, you begin to reconnect with something that has always been there. Not a personality, not a role, but a simple awareness. The part of you that notices thoughts, that feels emotions, that experiences life directly. This awareness does not need to be improved. It does not need to be protected. It is already complete. But it is often overlooked because attention is constantly focused on the identities that are built on top of it. Returning to this awareness is not something you achieve. It is something you notice. You notice that beneath all the roles, all the thoughts, all the adjustments, there is a stillness, a quiet presence that does not change depending on circumstances. And when you rest in that, even briefly, the sense of heaviness fades, because that awareness does not carry weight. It does not hold on to past mistakes. It does not worry about future outcomes. It simply observes without judgment, without resistance. And in that observation, there is peace. This is why abandoning false identities feels like lifting something heavy. Because you are no longer identifying with what creates tension. You are returning to what is naturally at ease. This does not mean you stop participating in life. You still speak, act, decide, engage, But there is less attachment to how those actions define you. You are no longer trying to prove something through everything you do, and that changes everything. Life becomes less about maintaining a version of yourself and more about experiencing what is happening right now. And in that shift, something very simple but very powerful becomes clear. You were never meant to carry all of that weight. It was learned, it was built, it was maintained, and it can be released, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually through awareness, each moment of noticing, each moment of letting go, each moment of choosing presence over performance. These moments add up. And over time, the heaviness that once felt permanent begins to dissolve, not because you have fixed yourself, but because you have stopped pretending to be someone you are not. And in that return, life begins to feel lighter again, and as that weight begins to fall away, something unexpected starts to come into view. When the effort of pretending loosens, when the pressure to maintain an image fades, there is a quiet space that opens up within you. It is subtle, almost easy to miss, but it is there. And in that space, a deeper question begins to rise. If you are not the roles you have been carrying, then who are you really? There is something within you that has been here long before any title was given to you, long before any expectation was placed on your shoulders, long before you learned what it means to succeed or fail. It has been quietly present through every stage of your life, watching, experiencing, aware. There is a part of you that has never needed to prove anything, and yet it has been forgotten. There is a strange feeling that begins to surface when you stop holding on to the roles you have been playing. At first, it can feel like emptiness, like something is missing, like you have lost a sense of direction. This happens because so much of identity has been built around labels. Without them, the mind feels uncertain. But this uncertainty is not a problem, it is the doorway. Most people have been taught to define themselves through external markers. Success becomes a description. Failure becomes a limitation. Expectations become a guide. And slowly, these labels begin to form a structure that feels solid, something to rely on. But this structure is not as stable as it seems. It changes constantly. What is considered success today may not hold the same meaning tomorrow. What feels like failure in one moment may later become a lesson. Expectations shift depending on who you are around, and because of this, the identity built on these things is always moving, always adjusting, never fully at rest. This constant movement creates tension. There is always something to maintain, something to protect, something to improve. Even when things are going well, there is a quiet pressure to keep it that way. And when things are not going well, there is a deeper pressure to fix it, to return to a version of yourself that feels more acceptable. But beneath all of this movement, there is something that does not move. It does not depend on success or failure. It does not change based on expectation. It does not need to be improved or protected. It is simply aware. This awareness is not something new. It has always been there. It was there when you were a child, before you knew what it meant to be judged or evaluated. It was there in moments of quiet, in moments of stillness, in moments when you were not thinking about who you were supposed to be. But as life became more complex, attention moved away from this simple awareness and toward the identities that needed to be built and maintained. And slowly, the connection to that original sense of self became less clear. This is what it means to forget yourself, not in a dramatic way, not as a complete loss, but as a gradual shift of attention. The focus moves outward, toward roles, toward labels, toward expectations, and the more attention is placed there, the less it is placed on the awareness that is always present. Returning to yourself is not about finding something new. It is about remembering what has been overlooked. It begins with noticing. Noticing that thoughts come and go, but something is always aware of them. Noticing that emotions rise and fall, but something remains present through all of it. Noticing that identities change depending on the situation, but something stays constant. This something is not a concept. It is not an idea. It is the simple experience of being aware. And when you begin to rest in this awareness, even briefly, something shifts. The need to define yourself begins to soften. You no longer feel the same urgency to label everything. You no longer feel the same pressure to fit into a specific identity. There is more space, more openness, more ease. This does not mean you stop participating in life. You still have responsibilities, you still have roles, but they are no longer who you are. They are simply things you move through. There is a difference between being a role and playing a role. When you are identified with a role, it feels heavy. It feels like something you have to carry at all times. But when you see it as something you are moving through, it becomes lighter. It becomes flexible. You can engage fully without being trapped by it. This is the freedom that comes from remembering the awareness beneath roles. There is also a quiet clarity that begins to appear. When you are not constantly filtering experience through labels, you begin to see things more directly. Without the need to categorize everything as good or bad, success or failure, right or wrong, there is a deeper understanding that emerges. You begin to notice that life is not as fixed as it once seemed. Situations change, people change, you change, and the labels that once felt so important begin to lose their grip. What remains is the experience itself, and when you are present with experience, without immediately trying to define it, there is a sense of lightness. There is less resistance, less tension, less need to control. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means they are no longer carrying the extra weight of identity. You are no longer thinking, this is happening to me, this says something about me, this defines me. Instead, there is a simpler recognition. This is happening. And that recognition is easier to hold. There is also a deeper sense of peace that begins to grow. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer constantly measuring yourself against changing standards. The mind becomes quieter, not completely silent, but less crowded, less filled with comparisons, with judgments, with expectations. And in that quiet, something very simple becomes clear. You are already here. You do not need to become anything to exist. You do not need to achieve anything to be aware. You do not need to meet any expectation to be present. This may sound obvious, but it is rarely felt. Because most of the time, attention is focused on becoming rather than being. But when you return to awareness, even for a moment, you feel it. A sense of completeness that does not depend on anything external. This is not something that needs to be maintained. It is always available. But it requires a shift in attention, from what you are doing to the awareness in which it is happening, from who you think you are to the simple fact that you are. This shift is subtle but powerful, and over time, it changes how you relate to everything. You begin to see that the labels you once held so tightly are not as important as they seemed. Success becomes something you experience, not something you are. Failure becomes something you learn from, not something that defines you. Expectations become something you can consider, not something you have to follow. There is more flexibility, more openness, more ease. And with that, the heaviness continues to fade, because you are no longer carrying the weight of being someone. You are simply being. This does not mean you stop growing or learning. It means that growth is no longer driven by a need to fix yourself, but by a natural curiosity. It becomes lighter, more like exploration, less like pressure. And in that shift, life begins to feel different. Not because it has changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer moving through it as a fixed identity trying to maintain itself. You are moving through it as awareness, open, present, and free. And that freedom is not something you achieve, it is something you remember. It has always been there, beneath the roles, beneath the labels, beneath the expectations. Quiet, steady, unchanged, waiting to be noticed again. And the moment you notice it, even briefly, you understand something that words can only point to. You understand that what you have been searching for is not somewhere else. It has been here all along, beneath everything, within you. And as that quiet recognition settles in, something else begins to reveal itself. When you stop defining yourself by roles, when you rest in simple awareness, life does not suddenly become perfect. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, situations still unfold in ways you did not plan. But there is a difference now. You begin to notice not just what is happening, but how you are relating to what is happening. And in that noticing, a deeper truth comes into view. Much of the heaviness you feel is not created by life itself, but by the resistance you hold against it. There is a subtle struggle that runs quietly beneath most experiences. It is not always loud. It does not always show up as obvious frustration. Sometimes it is just a small tightening in the chest, a quiet, "this shouldn't be happening," a silent attempt to push away what is already here. There is a kind of tension that appears the moment reality does not match expectation. A feeling arises that you did not want. A situation unfolds in a way you did not plan. Someone behaves in a way that does not align with how you think they should, and almost instantly, without thinking, resistance begins. It feels natural, it feels automatic, but it creates weight. There is a difference between pain and suffering. Pain is part of life. It is the feeling itself, the disappointment, the sadness, the discomfort. But suffering is what happens when the mind begins to argue with that pain, when it says, "This should not be here, this needs to go away, this is wrong." That argument is resistance. And resistance adds a second layer. The first layer is the experience itself. The second layer is the reaction to the experience. And it is this second layer that often becomes heavier than the first. Think about a simple moment. Something small goes wrong. Maybe a plan changes. Maybe a message is misunderstood. Maybe something does not go the way you expected. The initial feeling may be light, even manageable, but then the mind begins. This always happens. Why is this like this? This shouldn't be happening to me. And suddenly, what was small begins to feel large. This is how suffering grows. Not because life becomes more difficult, but because resistance multiplies the experience. The mind tries to fix, control, escape. It tries to reshape reality into something more comfortable. But in doing so, it creates tension. Because reality, in that moment, is already what it is. Fighting it does not change it. It only adds pressure. Buddhist wisdom points to this very clearly. It does not say that pain should be avoided at all costs. It says that suffering arises when there is clinging, when there is resistance to what is already present. And when you begin to see this, even slightly, something shifts. You start to notice the moment resistance begins, not after it has already taken over, but right as it starts. A small tightening, a subtle push, a quiet rejection of what is happening. And in that moment, there is a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a forced decision, but a gentle awareness. You can continue resisting, or you can pause. That pause is powerful, because in that pause, you stop adding the second layer. You allow the experience to be there without immediately trying to change it. This does not mean you like it. It does not mean you approve of it. It simply means you are not fighting it. And that changes the weight of the experience. A feeling that was heavy becomes lighter. Not because it disappears, but because it is no longer being pushed against. There is a strange relief that comes from this. At first, it can feel unfamiliar. The mind may still try to jump in, to analyze, to fix, to control. But when you gently return to simply observing, something softens. You begin to see that the experience itself is not as overwhelming as the resistance to it. This is not about becoming passive. It is not about accepting everything without action. It is about seeing clearly first, before reacting. When you see clearly, your response becomes more natural. Without resistance, actions are not driven by tension. They are not driven by fear or urgency. They arise from a place of clarity, and clarity is light. There is also something deeper that begins to unfold. When resistance drops even slightly, you begin to feel more connected to the present moment. Not because you are forcing yourself to be present, but because there is less pushing away from what is here. Presence is not something you create. It is what remains when resistance is not dominating your attention. And in that presence, there is space. Space to feel without being overwhelmed. Space to think without getting lost. Space to respond without reacting. This space changes everything. You begin to notice that even difficult experiences have a kind of flow. They arise, they move, they pass. But when resistance is added, they seem to get stuck. They linger, they repeat, they feel heavier than they are. Resistance creates the illusion of permanence. It makes a temporary feeling seem endless. But when you allow the experience to move naturally, without holding on to it or pushing it away, you begin to see its true nature. It changes. Everything changes. No feeling stays exactly the same. No situation remains fixed. But resistance makes it feel as though it does. This is why letting go of resistance is not about giving up. It is about allowing life to move. And when life is allowed to move, it feels lighter. There is less friction. There is also a kind of trust that begins to develop. Not a blind trust, not a forced belief, but a quiet understanding that not everything needs to be controlled, that you do not need to fight every moment that feels uncomfortable, that sometimes simply seeing clearly is enough. This trust reduces the constant tension of trying to manage everything. It allows you to rest more deeply in what is happening, and in that rest there is energy. The energy that was once used for resistance becomes available again. You feel less drained, less overwhelmed, more at ease. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means you are no longer making it harder than it needs to be. There is a subtle but powerful shift here. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this?" you begin to ask, "Can I allow this to be here, just for now?" That small change opens something, because allowing does not mean the experience stays forever. It means you are not adding extra weight to it. And often when the extra weight is removed, the experience moves on its own. It softens, it changes, it fades. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped holding it in place through resistance. This is the quiet freedom that comes from seeing clearly. You are no longer trapped in the cycle of fighting what is. You are no longer carrying the additional burden of resistance. You are simply present with what is happening, responding when needed, resting when possible. And in that simplicity, something becomes very clear. The heaviness you once felt was not just from life. It was from the constant effort to make life different than it is. And when that effort relaxes, even slightly, the weight begins to lift. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to feel the difference. Enough to breathe a little easier. Enough to see that peace is not found by controlling everything, but by no longer fighting everything. And as this understanding deepens, you begin to move through life in a different way. Not resisting every discomfort, not clinging to every preference, but allowing, observing, responding. And in that way of being, something quietly transforms. Life does not feel as heavy anymore because you are no longer carrying the resistance that once made it so. And as resistance begins to loosen, something even more subtle starts to reveal itself. When you stop fighting what is happening, when you allow experience to move without pushing against it, you begin to notice something that was always there, quietly shaping how heavy everything feels. It is not just the experience itself that creates weight. It is the belief that it will stay. There is a quiet fear hidden inside many emotions, not always obvious, not always spoken, but deeply felt. It is the sense that what you are feeling right now might not pass, that this heaviness might linger, that this discomfort might become permanent. And the moment that belief appears, something changes. The feeling becomes heavier. There is a strange kind of gravity that emotions seem to carry. Some feel light, easy to hold, quick to pass. Others feel dense, almost physical, as if they are pulling you downward. But this weight is not only coming from the emotion itself, it is coming from the way the mind relates to it. When a feeling is seen as temporary, it moves differently. It is allowed to rise, to exist, and to fade. But when a feeling is believed to be lasting, the mind begins to hold on to it in a different way. It watches it more closely. It analyzes it. It tries to understand why it is there and how long it will stay. And in doing so, it gives it more weight. Think about a simple moment. A wave of sadness appears. At first, it is just a feeling. It moves through the body. It shifts. It breathes. But then a thought comes in. What if this doesn't go away? That one thought changes everything. The sadness is no longer just a passing experience. It becomes something to fear, something to monitor, something to carry carefully as if it might stay longer than expected. This is where emotional gravity begins. The feeling itself has not changed, but the relationship to it has. And that relationship adds weight. Buddhist wisdom often speaks about impermanence, not as an idea to believe, but as something to observe directly. Everything changes. Thoughts change. Sensations change. Emotions change. Even the most intense feelings do not remain exactly the same for long. But the mind does something interesting. It takes a moment and stretches it. It takes a temporary feeling and imagines it continuing into the future. It creates a story around it. It begins to build a sense of permanence around something that is constantly moving. And that imagined permanence is what makes the feeling feel heavier than it is. There is also a kind of attachment that forms when permanence is believed. The mind begins to identify with the feeling. This is how I am. This is my state. This is something I have to live with. And once that identification forms, the feeling becomes more than just an experience. It becomes part of identity. And identity is heavier because it needs to be carried. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be understood. But when you begin to look more closely, something becomes clear. The feeling is not fixed. Even in its intensity, it is moving. There are small shifts within it. Changes in sensation, changes in intensity, moments where it feels stronger, moments where it softens slightly. It may still be present, but it is not static. This movement is often overlooked because attention is focused on the overall experience rather than the details within it. But when you begin to observe more carefully, you start to see that no feeling is exactly the same from one moment to the next. And this changes how you relate to it. Instead of seeing it as something solid, something fixed, you begin to see it as something fluid. And fluid things are easier to hold. There is less fear when you see movement, less urgency to escape, less need to control. This does not mean the feeling disappears instantly. It means it becomes lighter because you are no longer treating it as permanent. There is also a deeper layer to this. When you believe a feeling will last, the mind begins to prepare for it. It creates tension in anticipation. It braces, it tightens. This anticipation adds another layer of weight. It is not just the feeling you are experiencing, but the imagined continuation of it that you are reacting to. And that imagined future often feels heavier than the present moment itself. But when you return to what is actually here, without projecting it forward, something shifts. You see the feeling as it is now, not as it might be later. And in that clarity there is space. Space for the feeling to move, space for it to change, space for it to pass in its own time. There is a quiet relief in this. Not because the feeling is gone, but because it is no longer being held in a fixed way. You are no longer trying to predict its duration. You are simply allowing it to be what it is in this moment. And that allowance reduces the weight. There is also something important to understand about how the mind remembers emotions. When a feeling is experienced, it leaves a kind of imprint, not the exact feeling, but a memory of it. And when that memory is revisited, it can bring back a version of the original emotion. This creates the illusion that emotions are stacking, that they are accumulating over time. But in reality, each emotional experience is new. It may be similar to previous ones, but it is not the same. What creates the sense of accumulation is the repeated revisiting of the memory. And each time the memory is revisited, the feeling is reactivated. This makes it seem as though the emotion has been continuous, when in fact it has been recreated. Understanding this changes how you relate to emotional weight. You begin to see that what feels like a long-lasting heaviness is often a series of repeated moments, each one being reactivated by thought. And when this is seen clearly, something loosens. You no longer feel as though you are carrying a single, unbroken weight. You begin to see the gaps, the spaces where the feeling is not present, the moments where it softens, the times where it disappears completely, even if briefly. And those gaps matter, because they show you that the feeling is not permanent. They show you that it moves, that it changes, that it comes and goes. And this understanding reduces fear, because what is not permanent does not need to be held so tightly. There is also a shift in how you relate to intensity. When a feeling is strong, the mind often reacts with urgency. This is too much. I can't handle this. This needs to stop. But when you understand that intensity does not mean permanence, the reaction changes. You begin to see that even intense feelings rise and fall. They may feel overwhelming in the moment, but they do not stay at that level. They peak and then they move. And when you allow that movement without resisting or trying to fix it immediately, the experience becomes more manageable. Not because it is less intense, but because it is not being held as something that will last forever. This is the quiet shift from emotional gravity to emotional flow, from heaviness to movement, from permanence to impermanence. And in that shift, something very simple becomes clear. Feelings are not the problem. The belief that they will stay is what makes them feel heavy. When that belief softens, even slightly, the experience changes. There is more space, more ease, more ability to be with what is happening without feeling overwhelmed by it. And this does not require effort. It requires noticing how the mind turns moments into permanence, noticing how it holds onto feelings as if they are fixed, noticing how that holding creates weight, and gently, without force, allowing that holding to relax. Each time it relaxes, even a little, the weight lifts. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to feel the difference, enough to breathe more freely, enough to see that what once felt heavy is not as solid as it seemed. And over time, as this understanding deepens, your relationship to emotions changes. You are no longer afraid of them in the same way. You are no longer trying to escape them immediately. You are simply allowing them to move. And in that allowing, something very quiet but very powerful begins to unfold. Life feels lighter, not because emotions are gone, but because they are no longer being treated as permanent. They are seen for what they are, passing, changing, moving. And when you see that clearly, the gravity they once held begins to disappear, leaving behind something much simpler, something much lighter, something that was always there, beneath the weight. A sense of ease that does not come from controlling feelings, but from understanding their nature. And in that understanding, you continue to return to yourself, more deeply, more gently, more freely. And as you begin to see that emotions are not permanent, that they move and shift on their own, another layer quietly comes into focus. Even when a feeling is allowed to move, even when you are no longer afraid of how long it will last, there is still something that can make it feel heavier than it truly is. It is not the feeling itself. It is the way the mind claims it. There is a subtle habit that happens almost instantly, so quickly that it feels natural. A feeling arises, and without noticing, a label is placed on it. My pain, my anxiety, my sadness. And in that moment, something changes. The experience is no longer just happening, it becomes something you are carrying. There is a quiet weight that comes from ownership, not physical ownership, but psychological. The moment something is called mine, it becomes personal. It becomes attached to identity. It becomes something that needs to be managed, understood, or protected. And this is where the burden begins. There is a difference between feeling pain and calling it my pain. Feeling pain is direct. It is immediate. It exists in the moment. But calling it my pain creates a layer around it. It adds a sense of possession, a sense of self wrapped around the experience. And that layer adds weight, because once something is seen as mine, it is no longer just passing through. It becomes something you are responsible for, something you need to hold on to or get rid of or fix. The mind begins to build a story. Why is this happening to me? What does this say about me? How do I get rid of this? And suddenly, what was a simple experience becomes complicated. This is how mental ownership turns light experiences into heavy ones. Buddhist teachings often point to the idea that there is no fixed self behind experience, not in a way that denies your existence, but in a way that questions the assumption that everything that arises belongs to a solid, unchanging identity. When a feeling appears, it is not owned in the way the mind believes. It arises, it is felt, and it passes. But the mind does something different. It takes that feeling and attaches it to a sense of me. And once that attachment is made, the experience changes. It becomes something personal, something that defines you, something that needs to be dealt with. But if you look closely, something interesting becomes clear. The feeling does not actually say it belongs to you. It does not come with a label attached. It is simply there. The label is added by thought. And when that is seen, even briefly, something loosens. You begin to notice that the experience itself is not as heavy as the story around it. There is also a kind of pressure that comes from ownership. When something is seen as yours, there is an expectation that you should be able to control it. My anxiety should be managed. My sadness should be resolved. My stress should be reduced. And when control is not possible, frustration appears. Why can't I fix this? What is wrong with me? Why is this still here? This creates another layer of suffering. Not only is the feeling present, but there is also a sense of failure around not being able to change it. But when ownership is questioned, that pressure begins to fade. Instead of seeing the feeling as something that belongs to you, it becomes something that is happening. Not my anxiety, but anxiety is present. Not my sadness, but sadness is here. This small shift changes the entire experience, because when something is not owned, it is not as heavy. It does not need to be controlled in the same way. It does not need to be fixed immediately. It can be observed, allowed, and understood. There is more space, more distance. Not distance in the sense of disconnection, but distance in the sense of clarity. You are no longer completely inside the experience. You are aware of it. And awareness is lighter than ownership. There is also something important to notice about how ownership creates continuity. When a feeling is labeled as mine, it becomes part of a larger story. It connects to past experiences. I've always felt this way. This is something I struggle with. This is part of who I am. And this creates the sense that the feeling is ongoing, that it has been there for a long time, that it will continue into the future. But in reality, each experience is happening in the present. It may feel similar to previous ones, but it is not the same. Ownership ties these moments together into a single narrative. And that narrative makes the experience feel heavier. Because it is no longer just this moment, it becomes all moments. But when ownership is released, even slightly, that continuity begins to break. Each experience is seen more clearly as it is. A feeling arising now, a sensation moving now, a thought appearing now, without the need to connect it to a larger identity. And when that connection is not made, the experience becomes lighter. Because it is no longer carrying the weight of the past or the imagined future. There is also a kind of simplicity that returns. Without ownership, there is less need to analyze, less need to understand everything, less need to figure out why something is happening. There is just the experience itself. And this simplicity reduces mental effort. The mind becomes quieter, not because thoughts disappear completely, but because there is less attachment to them. They come, they go, without being claimed, without being held onto. This is not something that needs to be forced. It is something that happens naturally when you begin to notice the difference between experience and ownership. You may notice it in small moments. A feeling arises, and instead of immediately calling it mine, you pause. You simply notice it. There is a sensation in the body, a movement of energy, a shift in mood, and for a moment there is no label, just experience. And in that moment there is lightness, because nothing is being carried, nothing is being claimed, nothing is being turned into identity. This does not mean you become detached or indifferent. It means you are present without adding extra weight. You still feel, you still care, you still respond, but there is less burden, less pressure, less heaviness, because you are no longer holding everything as if it belongs to a fixed self. There is also a deeper kind of freedom that begins to appear. When you stop claiming every experience as mine, you begin to see that you are not limited by those experiences. They do not define you in the way you once believed. They are part of life, not part of identity, and this changes how you move through them. You are no longer trying to protect an identity. You are simply allowing experience to unfold. And in that allowing there is ease. There is less resistance, less fear, less attachment. Everything becomes more fluid, more open, more light. And over time, this understanding deepens. You begin to notice ownership in more subtle forms. Not just in obvious feelings, but in thoughts, in reactions, in expectations. My opinion, my belief, my situation. And each time you notice it, there is an opportunity to soften, to step back, to see the experience without immediately claiming it. This is not about losing yourself, it is about seeing more clearly. Seeing that what you thought was you is often a collection of experiences being held too tightly. And when that grip loosens, something remains, something that does not need to be defined, something that does not need to be protected, something that is simply aware. And in that awareness, there is no burden, because awareness does not own, it does not hold, it does not carry, it simply observes. And in that observation, everything becomes lighter, not because experiences disappear, but because they are no longer being turned into something they are not. They are no longer being made personal. They are simply happening. And when they are allowed to be just that, without ownership, without attachment, without the added weight of identity, something very simple becomes clear. The heaviness was never in the experience itself. It was in the way it was being held, and when the holding softens even slightly, the burden begins to lift, quietly, naturally, without effort. And as this continues, you find yourself returning even more deeply to that place within you that does not need to claim anything, that does not need to carry anything, and that simply is. And in that place, life feels lighter, because nothing is being held as mine. Everything is simply passing through, and you are no longer weighed down by what was never yours to carry. And as the grip of ownership begins to loosen, something even quieter starts to appear. When you stop calling every feeling mine, when you stop holding every experience as part of your identity, there is a small space that opens up. It may feel unfamiliar at first, almost like stepping back from something you were deeply inside of. In that space, you begin to notice something you may have overlooked for a long time. You are not the thoughts that pass through your mind. There is a strange moment when you first see this clearly. A thought appears, just like it always has. But instead of being pulled into it, instead of following it automatically, there is a pause. And in that pause, you notice something simple but powerful. You are aware of the thought, and that changes everything. There is a quiet kind of relief that comes when you realize that not every thought needs to be followed. Not every thought needs to be believed. Not every thought needs to define how you feel. Most of the time, thoughts move quickly, one leads to another, and before you notice, you are deep inside a chain of thinking. It feels like you are inside the thought, as if it has pulled you into its world. You are no longer just experiencing it, you are living inside it. This is what it means to be consumed, and when you are consumed, there is very little space. Everything feels immediate, everything feels real, everything feels important. But when you return to the observer, something shifts. The thought is still there, but you are not inside it in the same way. You are watching it. This is not something you create, it is something you notice. The observer has always been there, Even when you were lost in thought, there was something that was aware of that experience, but attention was focused on the content of the thought, not on the awareness itself. Returning to the observer is simply a shift in attention, from the thought to the awareness of the thought. And this shift creates space. In that space, thoughts lose some of their weight. Not because they disappear, but because they are no longer being held so tightly. There is less urgency, less need to react, less pressure to figure everything out immediately. This does not mean thoughts stop coming. They continue just as before, but your relationship to them changes. You begin to see that a thought is just a movement in the mind. It appears, it stays for a moment, and it fades. Just like a sound, just like a sensation, just like a passing cloud. But when you are identified with the thought, it feels solid. It feels permanent. It feels like something you have to deal with. When you are observing it, it feels lighter because you are no longer inside it. There is also a kind of calm that begins to develop. Not a forced calm, not something you try to create, but a natural calm that comes from not being pulled in every direction by every thought. You begin to notice that you can let a thought pass without following it. It comes and you see it. It stays and you allow it. It goes and you do nothing. This simple process creates a sense of ease because you are no longer trying to control the mind. You are simply observing it, and observation is lighter than control. There is also something important to understand here. Observing a thought does not mean rejecting it. It does not mean pushing it away or trying to silence it. It means allowing it to be there without becoming it. There is a difference. When you reject a thought, you are still engaged with it. You are still giving it attention, but when you observe it, you are not feeding it. You are simply aware. And in that awareness, the thought loses momentum and it moves on its own, without needing to be pushed, without needing to be held. This is where a deeper kind of freedom begins. You are no longer trapped in every thought that arises. You are no longer reacting to every mental movement. You are simply witnessing. And witnessing creates distance. Not a cold distance, not a disconnected distance, but a clear distance. A space where you can see things as they are. There is also a shift in how you experience emotions, because thoughts and emotions are closely connected. A thought can trigger a feeling. A feeling can trigger more thoughts, and this cycle can continue without pause. But when you return to the observer, this cycle begins to slow down. You see the thought before it fully develops. You notice the feeling before it takes over. And in that noticing, there is space to respond differently, not by forcing a change, but by not automatically continuing the pattern. This breaks the cycle, not completely, not instantly, but gradually. And as it breaks, the mind becomes quieter. Not silent, but less crowded, less reactive, more at ease. There is also a deeper recognition that begins to form. You begin to see that thoughts are not always accurate. They are not always true, and they are simply interpretations, stories, reflections of past experiences, fears, expectations. And when you observe them, you can see this more clearly. You can see that a thought is just one way of looking at something, not the only way, not necessarily the correct way. And this reduces the power that thoughts have over you because you are no longer taking them as absolute truth. You are seeing them as passing mental events. And passing things are lighter than fixed ones. There is also a kind of patience that develops. When you are not rushing to react to every thought, you begin to allow things to unfold more naturally. You do not feel the same urgency to fix everything immediately. You do not feel the same pressure to understand everything right away. You are more comfortable with not knowing, and this comfort reduces mental strain. Because the need to have everything figured out is one of the heaviest burdens the mind carries. When that need softens, even slightly, there is relief. There is also a sense of stability that begins to appear, not because life becomes predictable, but because your awareness is no longer constantly pulled in different directions. You are more grounded, more present, more steady, even when thoughts are active, even when emotions are moving. There is something within you that remains still, and that stillness is the observer. It does not change with every thought. It does not rise and fall with every feeling. It simply remains. And when you rest in that, even briefly, you feel it. A quiet sense of being, a calm that does not depend on what is happening, a lightness that comes from not being entangled. This is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you return to again and again. Each time you notice that you have been pulled into thought, you gently return, not with frustration, not with judgment, but with simple awareness. Oh, I was lost in thought, and in that noticing you are already back. There is no effort required, just recognition, and each time you return, the connection becomes clearer. The observer becomes more familiar, the space becomes more natural, and over time, this changes how you experience life. You are still thinking, you are still feeling, you are still living, but there is less heaviness because you are no longer carrying every thought as if it defines you. You are no longer being pulled by every mental movement. You are simply observing, allowing, being. And in that way of being, something very simple becomes clear. You are not the noise, you are the space in which the noise appears, and that space is quiet, open, light, always here, waiting to be noticed. And the more you return to it, the less life feels overwhelming, because you are no longer lost in everything that passes through your mind. You are resting in what remains, and in that resting, there is peace. A peace that does not come from controlling thoughts, but from no longer being controlled by them. A peace that does not need to be created, but simply recognized. And as this recognition deepens, you find yourself returning more often, more easily, more naturally. Until one day, without trying, you realize something has changed. The thoughts are still there, but they no longer carry the same weight, because you are no longer inside them. You are watching them, and in that watching, life becomes lighter, quieter, more clear, and you continue to return gently and naturally back to the observer, back to yourself. And as you begin to rest more often in that quiet place of observing, something even more hidden starts to come into view. When you are no longer fully inside your thoughts, when you are watching them instead of being carried by them, you begin to notice the tone beneath them, not just what the mind says, but how it speaks to you. There is a kind of pressure that does not come from the outside world. It does not come from situations or people or circumstances. It comes from within, in a voice so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. A quiet voice that corrects, that judges, that compares, that never seems fully satisfied. And over time, this voice becomes heavy. There is a pain that is not loud, not dramatic, but constant. It shows up in small moments, in the way you speak to yourself after a mistake, in the way you replay something you said and wish you had said it differently, in the way you measure yourself against an invisible standard and feel like you fall short. It is subtle, but it accumulates. This is the quiet weight of self-rejection. It does not happen all at once. It builds slowly through repeated moments of inner criticism. Each moment may seem small, almost harmless. A quick judgment, a slight disappointment, a passing thought of, "That was not good enough." But these moments do not disappear completely. They leave a trace, and over time these traces begin to form a pattern of seeing yourself not as you are, but as someone who needs to be fixed, improved, corrected. There is a kind of violence in this, not physical, not visible, but real, because each moment of rejection is a moment of separation. A moment where you turn away from yourself instead of toward yourself, and that turning away creates tension. You begin to feel as though you are not on your own side. As though there is something within you that is constantly watching, evaluating, waiting for you to do something wrong. This creates a kind of inner division. One part of you that is experiencing life and another part that is judging that experience. And this division is exhausting because it never fully rests. Even in quiet moments, the voice can still be there, subtle but present. You could have done better. That was not enough. You should be further along by now. These thoughts may seem normal, even helpful at times. They can push you to improve, to grow, to avoid repeating mistakes. But when they become constant, when they become the default way you relate to yourself, they begin to create weight. Because there is no space to simply be, everything becomes something to evaluate, something to measure, something to correct. And this constant evaluation creates tension in the body, a tightness, a restlessness, a sense that you are never fully at ease, even when nothing is wrong. This is the cost of self-rejection. Buddhist wisdom points to something very simple here. Suffering does not only come from external difficulties, it also comes from the way you relate to your own experience. And when that relationship is based on rejection, the suffering deepens. Because you are not only facing what is happening, you are also fighting yourself while it is happening. There is a moment that begins to change everything. A moment where you notice the inner voice, not as truth, but as a pattern. You hear the criticism, but instead of immediately believing it, you pause, you observe it, just like you observed thoughts before. And in that observation, something becomes clear. The voice is not you. It is a learned pattern, a repetition of ideas, expectations, standards that have been absorbed over time. It may sound familiar, it may feel convincing, but it is not your essence. It is something that has been built. And what has been built can be seen, and what can be seen can begin to loosen. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop identifying with that voice. It does not disappear immediately. It may still appear, still speak, still criticize. But it no longer has the same authority. It becomes just another thought. And when it is seen that way, it loses some of its weight. There is also a different way of relating that begins to emerge. Instead of rejecting yourself in moments of difficulty, you begin to allow. Not in a passive way, not by ignoring what needs to be improved, but by removing the harshness. You begin to see that growth does not require rejection, that change does not require criticism, that you can move forward without turning against yourself. This changes the internal environment. It becomes less hostile, less tense, more open, and in that openness there is space for something new, a kind of quiet support, not loud encouragement, not forced positivity, but a simple presence that does not attack. That allows mistakes without turning them into identity. That sees imperfections without making them personal failures. This presence is gentle, and that gentleness reduces weight, because you are no longer carrying the pressure of being perfect. You are no longer fighting against your own experience. You are simply moving through it. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. You begin to see that much of what you criticize in yourself is based on comparison. Comparison to others, comparison to an ideal, comparison to a version of yourself that exists only in thought. And these comparisons create distance. Distance between where you are and where you think you should be. And that distance feels heavy. But when you step out of comparison, even briefly, something shifts. You return to what is actually here, not what should be, not what could be, but what is. And in that return, there is less pressure. Because you are no longer measuring yourself against something that is not real. You are simply present. There is also a kind of forgiveness that begins to appear, not as something you force, but as something that naturally arises when you stop holding on to criticism. You begin to see that you have been doing the best you can with the understanding you had at the time. That mistakes were not signs of failure, but part of the process of learning. And this understanding softens the way you relate to your past. You are no longer carrying it as a weight. You are seeing it as part of your path. And this lightens the present, because you are not dragging old judgments into current moments. You are allowing things to be as they are. There is also a physical effect. When self-rejection softens, the body relaxes. The tightness in the chest eases. The breath becomes deeper. The constant low-level tension begins to fade because the body is no longer responding to internal attack. It is no longer bracing against its own experience. It is simply being, and that being feels lighter. There is also a sense of safety that begins to grow. Not safety from the outside world, but safety within. A feeling that you are not constantly under pressure from your own mind. That you can exist without being judged every moment. And this safety allows for deeper rest. Not just physical rest, but mental rest. A quiet that does not need to defend or correct. A space where you can simply be present. And in that space, something very simple becomes clear. You are never meant to be in conflict with yourself. The heaviness you feel is not because you are not enough. It is because you have been treating yourself as if you are not enough. And when that treatment changes even slightly, everything begins to shift. The weight begins to lift, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer adding extra pressure on top of it. You are no longer turning every moment into a test. You are simply allowing yourself to move through life without constant rejection. And in that allowing there is lightness, there is ease, there is a quiet kind of peace that does not come from perfection, but from acceptance. Not acceptance as a concept, but as a way of being, a way of relating to yourself that does not create division, that does not create tension, that does not create weight. And as this way of being deepens, you find yourself returning again and again to that simple awareness, the awareness that observes without judgment, that allows without resistance, that remains steady beneath all experiences. And in that awareness there is no rejection, there is only presence, and that presence is light, always here, always available, waiting not to change you, but to remind you that you were never meant to carry the weight of being against yourself. And the moment you stop, even for a second, you feel it. The heaviness softens, the tension fades, and something within you relaxes, as if it has been waiting for this all along. And as that quiet acceptance begins to replace inner rejection, something else slowly comes into view. When you are no longer fighting yourself, when the harsh voice softens, there is a sense of relief, but also a subtle realization. For a long time, it was not just self-criticism that created weight, it was also the constant feeling that where you are right now is not enough. There is a quiet habit that most people live inside without ever questioning it, the belief that peace exists somewhere ahead, not here, not now, but later. There is a subtle tension that appears when you believe that who you are in this moment is incomplete, that something is missing, that there is a better version of you waiting in the future, and once you reach that version, everything will finally feel right. It sounds harmless, even motivating, but it creates distance between you and this moment. There is always something to fix, something to improve, something to become. And while growth itself is not the problem, the constant sense that you are not yet where you need to be creates pressure. Because the present moment becomes a stepping stone, not a place to rest. There is a quiet dissatisfaction that follows this way of thinking. Even when things are going well, there is still something missing. Even when progress is made, it never feels complete, because the mind immediately moves the goal forward. There is still more to do. You are not there yet. Keep going. And so, the chase continues. This is the illusion of forward escape. The idea that peace is something you will arrive at rather than something that is available now. There is a strange irony in this. The more you chase peace, the further it seems, because the act of chasing creates tension. It reinforces the idea that something is lacking in the present, and that idea alone creates heaviness. Buddhist wisdom points to something very simple here. The future is always imagined. It exists as a thought, as a projection, as a possibility. But peace does not exist in imagination. It exists in direct experience. And direct experience is always here, now. There is a quiet shift that begins when you see this clearly, not as an idea, but as something you notice in your own experience. You notice how often your attention moves forward. How will things be later? When will this improve? What will I become? And in that movement, you leave the present. You leave the only place where life is actually happening. And the further attention moves into the future, the more disconnected you feel from what is here. This disconnection creates a sense of restlessness, a feeling that something is always unfinished, because the mind is always focused on what is next. There is also a subtle rejection of the present moment, not in a loud way, but in a quiet way, a feeling that this moment is not enough. that it needs to be different, that it needs to be improved. And this rejection creates tension, because the present moment cannot be anything other than what it is. Fighting it or trying to move beyond it mentally does not change it. It only creates distance from it. But when you begin to notice this pattern, something shifts. You begin to see that the idea of a better future self is just that. An idea, a mental image, a projection created by thought, and while it can be useful in certain ways, it can also become a trap, because it keeps you moving forward without ever allowing you to arrive. There is always another version of yourself to reach, a more complete version, a more successful version, a more peaceful version. And because that version is always in the future, it is never fully real. It is always just out of reach. This creates a loop. You move forward, but you never feel settled. You improve, but you never feel complete. You grow, but you never feel at rest, because rest is always postponed. There is also something else that happens. When you are constantly focused on becoming, you begin to overlook being. You overlook the simple experience of this moment, the breath, the sensations in your body, the quiet presence that is always here. These things are not dramatic, they are not exciting, but they are real. And when attention returns to them, there is a different kind of peace. A peace that does not depend on becoming something else. A peace that is already here. This does not mean you stop growing. It does not mean you abandon goals or stop improving your life. It means that growth is no longer driven by a sense of lack. It becomes something natural. Something that arises from curiosity, from interest, from engagement with life, not from the pressure to become enough. There is a difference between growing because you are not enough and growing because you are already whole. One creates tension, the other creates flow. When you grow from a place of lack, every step feels heavy because it is tied to identity. It is tied to proving something. But when you grow from a place of presence, every step feels lighter, because it is not about becoming someone else. It is about expressing what is already here. There is also a quiet relief that comes from letting go of the need to arrive, the need to reach a final state, the need to become complete, because you begin to see that life is not a destination. It is a continuous unfolding. There is no final version of you that you need to reach in order to be at peace. Peace is not at the end. It is in the way you relate to each moment. And when you stop postponing it, you begin to feel it, not as something dramatic, but as a subtle ease, a quiet sense of enoughness, right here, right now. There is also a change in how you experience time. When you are always focused on the future, time feels fast. It feels like something you are chasing, something that is slipping away. But when you return to the present, time feels different. It slows down, not in a literal sense, but in how it is experienced. There is more space in each moment, more depth, more clarity. And in that space, there is less urgency, less pressure, less need to rush. Because you are no longer trying to get somewhere else. You are here, fully. There is also a deeper kind of trust that begins to develop. Not a blind trust that everything will go perfectly, but a quiet understanding that you do not need to control every step of your path. That life unfolds on its own. That growth happens naturally when you are present. That becoming does not need to be forced. And this trust reduces the constant tension of trying to manage everything. It allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of expectation. There is also something important to notice about satisfaction. When you are always focused on the future, satisfaction is delayed. It is something you will feel later, when things are better, when you are better. But later never arrives in the way you expect, because when you reach that point, the mind creates another goal, another version, another place to go, and so satisfaction remains out of reach. But when you return to the present, satisfaction becomes available, not as a permanent state, but as a moment-to-moment experience, a simple recognition that this moment is enough, that you are enough, not in a perfect way, but in a complete way, and that recognition brings peace. There is also a kind of freedom that comes from letting go of the future as a place of escape, because you are no longer running from the present. You are no longer trying to get away from what is here. You are simply here. And in that presence, there is clarity. You see things more directly. You respond more naturally. You are less influenced by imagined outcomes. Because you are not living in those outcomes. You are living in what is actually happening. And this changes everything. Life becomes less about reaching and more about experiencing. Less about becoming and more about being. Less about escaping and more about allowing. And in that shift, something very simple becomes clear. The peace you were looking for in the future was never there. It was always here, hidden beneath the constant movement of the mind, hidden beneath the belief that you needed to become something else. And the moment that belief softens, even slightly, the distance disappears. You are no longer chasing, you are no longer escaping. You are simply present, and in that presence, life feels lighter. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer carrying the weight of needing it to be. You are here, fully, without needing to be somewhere else, and that is enough, more than enough. It is everything, and as you rest in that, you begin to see that the journey you thought was ahead of you has always been right where you are, waiting, not for you to arrive, but for you to stop leaving. And as the need to chase a future version of yourself begins to fade, something softer begins to take its place. When you are no longer trying to escape the present, when you are no longer pushing yourself toward an imagined destination, there is a quiet shift that happens. You begin to notice how much effort you are using just to move through life. Not the effort of doing something meaningful, but the effort of forcing everything, forcing decisions, forcing clarity, forcing yourself to feel a certain way, forcing life to follow a direction you have already planned in your mind. And when that forcing begins to loosen, something unexpected appears. Things begin to move more naturally. There is a quiet tension that most people carry without realizing it. It is not always visible, but it is always present. It shows up in the way you think, in the way you act, in the way you try to control outcomes. It feels like you are always pushing against something, trying to make things happen, trying to keep things from falling apart, trying to become someone. This constant pushing creates weight. Even simple actions begin to feel heavy. Decisions feel complicated. Tasks feel draining, because they are not just actions, they are efforts layered with pressure. Pressure to get it right. Pressure to move forward. Pressure to not fall behind. But when you begin to return to the present, when you stop chasing and stop resisting, something changes. The pressure begins to dissolve, and without that pressure, action becomes different. There is less hesitation, less overthinking, less resistance. You begin to act from a place that feels more direct, more simple. This is what true alignment feels like. Not something you create, but something you return to. Alignment is not about making everything perfect. It is about removing what is unnecessary, the tension, the force, the constant effort to control. When these fall away, what remains is a natural movement. You begin to notice that some actions do not require force. They arise on their own. You get up when it is time to get up. You speak when something needs to be said. You move when there is movement to be made. There is less inner debate, less back and forth, less friction. This does not mean you stop making decisions. It means decisions become clearer because they are not clouded by pressure. There is a difference between acting from force and acting from clarity. When you act from force, there is tension behind it, a need to prove something, a fear of getting it wrong, a pressure to achieve a certain outcome. But when you act from clarity, there is ease, not because the action is always easy, but because it is not being resisted internally. There is a kind of flow, a sense that things are unfolding rather than being pushed. This flow is often misunderstood. People think it means everything becomes effortless in the sense of no challenge. But that is not what it is. Effort may still be there, energy may still be used, but it is not heavy because it is not forced. There is a difference between effort and struggle. Effort is natural. It is the energy used to do something. Struggle is resistance. It is the tension added on top of effort. And it is struggle that creates heaviness. When you are aligned, effort remains, but struggle fades. You still act. You still engage, you still move forward, but there is less internal conflict, less pushing, less forcing. And because of that, everything feels lighter. There is also a change in how you relate to outcomes. When you are forcing things, outcomes become very important. They carry weight, they determine how you feel. Success feels like relief, failure feels like pressure. But when you are aligned, outcomes are still relevant, but they do not define your state. You do what needs to be done. You give your attention to the process, and you allow the result to unfold. There is less attachment, less tension. Because you are not trying to control everything, you are simply participating. There is also a deeper sense of trust that begins to develop. Not trust that everything will go exactly as planned, but trust that you can respond to whatever happens. This reduces the need to force outcomes, because you are not relying on a specific result to feel at ease. You are already at ease in the process, and this changes how you experience life. Things feel less urgent, less pressured, more open. You begin to notice that when you are not forcing, you are more present, more aware, more connected to what is happening. And from that presence, actions arise naturally. You do what is needed, when it is needed, without overcomplicating it, without adding unnecessary effort. There is also a physical aspect to this. When you are forcing, the body tightens. The breath becomes shallow. There is tension in the muscles, a sense of pushing. But when you are aligned, the body softens, the breath deepens. There is more ease in movement, less strain. Even when you are doing something that requires energy, it does not feel as heavy, because the body is not resisting. It is simply moving. There is also a kind of intelligence in this natural movement. When you are not forcing, you are more in tune with what is actually needed. You are not reacting based on fear or pressure. You are responding based on clarity. This leads to better decisions, not because you are trying harder, but because you are not clouding your perception with unnecessary effort. There is also a simplicity that begins to emerge. When you stop forcing, life becomes less complicated. Not because everything becomes easy, but because you are no longer adding layers of tension. You are not overthinking every step. You are not trying to control every detail. You are simply moving with what is happening. And this simplicity reduces mental load. The mind becomes quieter, less busy, more clear. There is also a kind of freedom that comes with this, because you are no longer bound by the need to force everything. You are free to act, but also free to pause, free to move, but also free to rest. There is no constant pressure pushing you forward, only a natural rhythm. And in that rhythm, there is balance. You begin to trust that not everything needs to be done right now, that not everything needs to be solved immediately, that things can unfold in their own time. And this trust reduces urgency, reduces pressure, reduces weight. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. You begin to see that much of what you thought required force was actually being complicated by resistance. When resistance drops, the path becomes clearer. Not because the situation changes, but because your relationship to it changes. You are no longer fighting against what is happening. You are moving with it, and this movement feels lighter, more fluid, more natural. There is also a shift in how you experience yourself. You are no longer trying to be a certain way. You are simply being. Actions arise from that being, not from a need to prove something, not from a fear of being something else, but from a natural expression of what is present. And this expression feels authentic. It feels real, because it is not forced. There is also a kind of quiet satisfaction that comes with this. Not the satisfaction of achieving something, but the satisfaction of moving through life without unnecessary strain, of doing what needs to be done without carrying extra weight, of being present without trying to control everything. And this satisfaction is steady. It does not depend on outcomes. It does not fluctuate with success or failure. It is simply there because it comes from alignment. And as this alignment deepens, something very simple becomes clear. Life does not need to be forced. It can be lived fully, naturally, without the constant pressure to make everything happen a certain way. And when you stop forcing, you begin to see that much of what you were trying to create was already available. Clarity, ease, flow. They were not things you had to build. They were things that appear when resistance and pressure fall away. And in that appearance, life feels lighter. Not because you are doing less, but because you are no longer adding unnecessary effort to everything you do. You are simply moving, acting, responding, being. And in that state, something shifts. The weight you once carried begins to disappear. Not all at once, but steadily, naturally, as you continue to return to that place within you where action does not come from force, but from alignment. And in that place, life flows, quietly, effortlessly, as it was always meant to. And as life begins to flow with less force, as actions start to arise more naturally without constant pressure, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even when you stop pushing, even when you begin to move with more ease, there can still be a subtle tension beneath it all. A tension that is not always obvious, but always present. The need to control. There is a quiet tightening that happens when things feel uncertain. It does not always show up as panic or fear. Sometimes it is just a small urge to adjust, to fix, to manage, to make sure everything stays within a certain direction, and over time this urge becomes exhausting. There is a kind of fatigue that does not come from doing too much, but from trying to control too much. It is not the action itself that drains you, but the constant need to make sure everything goes a certain way. There is a pressure that builds when you believe that things must be handled perfectly, that outcomes must be managed, that nothing should fall out of place. And this belief creates a constant state of tension, because life does not move in straight lines. It changes, it shifts. It unfolds in ways that cannot always be predicted. And when you try to control something that is constantly changing, the effort never ends. There is always something to monitor, something to adjust, and something to worry about. And this creates a continuous drain. The mind becomes busy, not just with thinking, but with managing, planning ahead, replaying the past, trying to prepare for every possible outcome. And even when nothing is happening, the mind is still working, still trying to stay ahead, still trying to keep everything under control. This is the hidden tension of control. It feels like responsibility, it feels like awareness, but beneath it there is strain, because control is not stable. It requires constant effort. There is also a fear that sits quietly underneath the need for control. The fear of things going wrong, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of not being able to handle what comes next. And to avoid that fear, the mind tries to stay in charge, like it tries to predict, to plan, to prevent. But this creates another layer of pressure, because no matter how much you plan, there are always things you cannot control. And when those things happen, the mind tightens even more, trying harder, pushing more, adding more effort. This is where fatigue deepens, not from life itself, but from the constant attempt to manage it. There is a moment that begins to change everything, a moment where you notice the effort. Not the action, but the strain behind it, the subtle tension in your body, the tightness in your thoughts, the feeling that you are holding something together. And in that noticing, something shifts. You begin to question, do I really need to control this? Not in a careless way, not by ignoring what matters, but by seeing clearly what is actually within your influence and what is not. There is a difference. Some things require action, some things require attention, but many things are simply unfolding. And trying to control them does not change the outcome. It only adds tension. When you begin to see this, even slightly, the grip loosens. You stop holding everything so tightly. You allow some things to be as they are. And in that allowing, there is relief. There is less pressure, less urgency, less need to manage every detail. This does not mean you stop caring, and it means you stop over-controlling. You still act where action is needed, but you do not carry the weight of trying to control everything. There is also a shift in how you relate to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt uncomfortable, something to avoid and something to fix. But when control begins to soften, uncertainty becomes different. It becomes space, space for things to unfold, space for life to move. And this space is lighter than control because it does not require constant effort. It allows movement. There is also a deeper trust that begins to grow. Not a blind trust that everything will go perfectly, but a quiet understanding that you do not need to control everything to be okay. That you can respond to what happens. That you do not need to prevent every possible outcome. And this trust reduces the constant tension of trying to stay ahead. You are no longer living in anticipation, you are living in presence. And presence is lighter. There is also a physical change that happens. When control softens, the body relaxes. The breath becomes deeper, the shoulders drop, the constant low-level tension begins to fade. Because the body is no longer bracing, no longer preparing for every possible scenario. It is simply here, responding to what is actually happening, not what might happen. This reduces fatigue, not because you are doing less, but because you are carrying less. There is also a change in how you experience time. When you are trying to control everything, time feels tight. There is always something to do, something to prepare, something to manage. But when control softens, time opens. There is more space in each moment, more ease, less rushing. Because you are not trying to get ahead of life, you are moving with it. There is also a kind of clarity that appears. When you are not overwhelmed by the need to control, you can see things more clearly. You can respond more directly, without overthinking, without adding unnecessary layers. And this clarity leads to better action. Not forced action, but natural action. The kind that arises from understanding rather than pressure. There is also a quiet freedom in letting go of control. Because you are no longer bound by the need to manage everything. You are free to act when needed, free to pause when needed, free to allow things to unfold. This freedom is not chaotic, it is balanced. It comes from understanding the difference between what you can influence and what you cannot. And staying with that understanding, there is also a deeper realization that begins to form. Much of the control you try to hold is not actually necessary. Life has its own movement, its own rhythm. And when you stop interfering with it constantly, you begin to see that things still happen, things still unfold, not always as planned, but often in ways that are workable. And this reduces the need to control, because you see that control was not the source of stability. It was the source of tension. There is also a shift in how you experience yourself. You are no longer the one who has to manage everything. You are simply part of the process, participating, responding, allowing, and this reduces the pressure of identity. You are no longer defined by how well you control things. You are simply present with what is happening. And that presence is lighter. There is also a kind of quiet peace that comes with this. Not because everything is under control, but because you are no longer trying to make it so. You are allowing life to move. You are allowing uncertainty to exist. You are allowing things to be as they are. And in that allowing there is ease. There is less resistance, less tension, less fatigue, because you are no longer fighting the natural movement of life. You are moving with it. And as this becomes more natural, something very simple becomes clear. The exhaustion you once felt was not from life itself. It was from trying to control what could not be controlled. And when that effort softens, even slightly, the weight begins to lift. Not all at once, but enough to feel the difference, enough to breathe more freely, enough to see that peace is not found in control, but in letting go of the need to control. And as you continue to return to that understanding, again and again, something changes. Life feels lighter. Not because it is perfectly managed, but because it is no longer being held so tightly. And in that looseness there is flow, there is ease, there is rest. And you find yourself no longer trying to control everything, but simply being present with what is. And that is enough, more than enough. It is freedom. And as the grip of control begins to loosen, as the constant need to manage everything starts to fade, something unexpected begins to open. When you stop trying to force certainty, when you stop holding life so tightly, you are left with something that once felt uncomfortable, not knowing. At first it can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because for a long time, certainty felt like safety. Having answers felt like control. Knowing what comes next felt like stability. But as that need softens, you begin to notice something quietly surprising. Not knowing is not as heavy as you thought. There is a quiet discomfort that appears when answers are not available, when the future is unclear, when things do not fit into a defined direction. The mind immediately reacts. What if this goes wrong? What should I do next? I need to figure this out. And in that reaction, tension begins. Because the mind is trying to fill a space that does not need to be filled. Uncertainty itself is not the problem. It is the resistance to uncertainty that creates weight. There is a difference between not knowing and needing to know. Not knowing is simply a state. Needing to know creates pressure, and that pressure becomes exhausting. For most of life, you are taught to seek answers, to define things, to have clarity, and while there is value in understanding, there is also a hidden cost when the need for certainty becomes constant. Because life does not always provide clear answers, things change, situations unfold. Outcomes are not always predictable, and when you expect certainty in a world that is constantly moving, there is always tension. There is always something unresolved, something unfinished, something to figure out. But when you begin to allow not knowing, something shifts. The tension softens, the urgency fades, because you are no longer trying to force clarity where it does not exist. There is also a quiet kind of openness that comes with uncertainty. When you do not know what will happen next, there is space. Space for possibilities, space for things to unfold in ways you did not plan. This space can feel uncomfortable at first, because the mind prefers structure, it prefers knowing, it prefers predictability. But that preference creates limitation, because it narrows your experience to what you expect. When you release that need, even slightly, your experience becomes wider, more open, more fluid. You are no longer confined to a single path. You are allowing life to reveal itself. There is also a deeper kind of presence that emerges. When you are not focused on figuring out the future, your attention returns to what is here, this moment, this breath, this experience, and in that presence there is a different kind of clarity, not the clarity of having answers, but the clarity of being aware. You begin to see things more directly, without the filter of expectation, without the pressure to predict. This makes your responses more natural, more grounded, because they are based on what is actually happening, not on what you think might happen. There is also a quiet freedom in not knowing, because you are no longer bound by the need to be right. You are no longer carrying the pressure of having everything figured out. You are simply exploring, learning, moving through life without the constant need to define it. This freedom is light, because it removes a large burden, the burden of certainty. There is also a shift in how you experience mistakes. When you believe you need to know everything, mistakes feel heavy. They feel like failures, signs that you were wrong. But when you allow not knowing, mistakes become different. They become part of the process, part of learning, part of movement. They are no longer something to avoid at all costs. They are something to move through, and this reduces fear, because you are not trying to get everything perfect. You are simply allowing yourself to experience. There is also a deeper trust that begins to grow. Not trust in a specific outcome, but trust in your ability to handle what comes. When you are not trying to predict everything, you begin to see that you can respond to what arises, that you do not need to know everything in advance, that you can meet life as it happens, and this trust reduces the need for control. Because you are no longer trying to prevent every possible outcome. You are simply present, ready to respond. There is also a change in how you experience decisions. When you need certainty, decisions feel heavy. You try to analyze every possibility. You try to predict every outcome. You try to choose the perfect path. But when you allow not knowing, decisions become simpler. You choose based on what is clear now, not based on trying to control the future. And this reduces mental strain, because you are not trying to calculate everything. You are simply moving forward. There is also a kind of quiet peace that appears. Not because everything is known, but because you are no longer resisting the unknown. You are allowing it. And in that allowing there is ease, there is less tension, less urgency, less pressure, because you are not trying to hold something that cannot be held. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. Certainty is not always real. Much of what you think you know is based on assumptions, on past experiences, on patterns. But life is always changing, and what feels certain now can shift at any moment. When you see this clearly, the need for certainty softens, because you realize it was never as solid as it seemed, and this makes uncertainty less threatening, more natural, more part of life. There is also a kind of curiosity that begins to replace fear. When you are not trying to control everything, you become more open to what is happening, more interested, more engaged, because you are not confined by expectations, you are simply experiencing. And this makes life feel more alive, more dynamic, more real. There is also a physical relaxation that comes with this. When you are not trying to figure everything out, the body softens, the breath becomes deeper, the constant tension begins to fade. Because the mind is not pushing, not forcing, not trying to resolve everything, it is simply allowing. And that allowing feels light. There is also a sense of relief, because you are no longer carrying the responsibility of knowing everything. You are no longer trying to solve the entire future. You are simply here, in this moment, responding to what is present. And that is enough, more than enough. There is also a deeper connection to life, because when you are not focused on certainty, you are more open to experience. You notice more. You feel more, you are more present, and this presence brings a different kind of richness, not based on knowing, but based on being. There is also a shift in how you see yourself. You are no longer the one who has to have all the answers. You are simply someone moving through life, learning, experiencing, growing, without needing to define everything. And this reduces pressure, because you are not trying to be perfect, you are simply being. There is also a quiet confidence that begins to grow. Not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of presence. The confidence that you can handle what comes, that you can respond, that you can move forward, even without knowing everything. And this confidence is steady, because it does not depend on having answers. It depends on being present. There is also a deeper realization that begins to settle. Not knowing is not a weakness, it is a natural state. Life itself is uncertain, always changing, always unfolding, and trying to force certainty onto it only creates tension. But when you align with uncertainty, when you allow it, when you embrace it, something changes. Life feels lighter, because you are no longer carrying the weight of needing to know. You are simply present, open, available, and in that openness, there is freedom. A quiet, steady freedom that does not come from control, but from letting go. And as this understanding deepens, you find yourself more at ease, more relaxed, more connected to what is happening. Because you are no longer trying to escape uncertainty, you are allowing it. And in that allowing, something very simple becomes clear. You do not need to know everything to be at peace. You only need to be here, fully, without resistance, without pressure, without the need to define what comes next. And in that state, life feels lighter, more open, more free, as it always was, before the need to know took over. And as you continue to return to that place, again and again, you begin to feel it more deeply. The natural lightness of not knowing, the quiet freedom of uncertainty, the ease of simply being, right here, right now, without needing anything else. And as uncertainty becomes less threatening, as the need to know begins to loosen, something else starts to become clearer. When you stop trying to figure everything out in your mind, when you stop searching for answers in endless thought, your attention begins to move somewhere quieter, somewhere more stable. It moves into the body, because even when the mind is uncertain, even when the future is unclear, there is something that remains constant: sensation, breath, presence. And in that presence, there is a way back to yourself that does not require answers, only awareness. There is a quiet signal that most people overlook, a subtle feeling in the body that is always there, always present, always available. But it is often ignored, because attention is pulled into thinking, into planning, into trying to understand everything, and in that constant movement of thought the body becomes distant, almost invisible. But the body has never left. It has been there the entire time, holding tension, holding emotion, holding the quiet truth of what is happening in this moment. When you begin to notice the body again, something shifts, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gently. You begin to feel what is already here. The weight of your breath, the pressure of your body against where you sit or lie, the subtle movements that happen without effort. And in noticing these, the mind begins to slow down, because attention is no longer feeding the constant stream of thought. It is resting in something real, something immediate. And there is a difference between thinking about the present and feeling the present. Thinking keeps you at a distance. Feeling brings you here, and the body is the doorway to that feeling. When you pay attention to your breath, not by controlling it, but by simply noticing it, there is a quiet rhythm that becomes clear. Inhale, exhale, rising, falling. This rhythm has always been there. It does not depend on your thoughts. It does not depend on your plans. It continues whether you notice it or not. But when you do notice it, something changes. The mind begins to settle, because it has something simple to rest on. There is also a grounding that comes from feeling the body. When the mind is lost in thought, it moves into past and future. It drifts, it loops, it searches, but the body is always here, always in the present moment. When you bring attention to it, you are brought back. Not through effort, but through awareness. You begin to feel your hands, your feet, the subtle sensations that are usually ignored. And in that feeling, there is stability. Because you are no longer floating in thought. You are connected. There is also a kind of honesty in the body. Thoughts can be misleading. They can create stories. They can exaggerate. They can repeat patterns that are not real. But the body reflects what is actually happening. If there is tension, you feel it. If there is calm, you feel it. If there is discomfort, it is present. And when you pay attention to these sensations without trying to change them, you begin to understand something deeper. You begin to see what is real in this moment, without interpretation, without judgment. There is also a shift in how you relate to discomfort. When something feels unpleasant, the usual reaction is to resist it, to avoid it, to push it away. But when you bring attention to the body, when you allow yourself to feel what is there without immediately reacting, something changes. The discomfort becomes more clear, more defined, less overwhelming, because you are not adding resistance to it, you are simply feeling it. And in that feeling, the intensity often softens, not because you are forcing it to change, but because you are no longer fighting it. There is also a deeper connection between the body and emotion. Emotions are not just thoughts, they are felt in the body. Tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a heaviness in the shoulders. These sensations are signals, not problems. But when they are ignored, they build, they accumulate, they create tension. But when you bring awareness to them, when you allow yourself to feel them fully, something begins to release, not always immediately, but gradually, because you are no longer holding them unconsciously. You are allowing them to be seen. There is also a simplicity in this practice. It does not require complex understanding. It does not require perfect conditions. It only requires attention, simple attention. Noticing what is already happening, feeling what is already present. And this simplicity makes it accessible at any moment. You do not need to change your environment. You do not need to stop what you are doing. You can bring awareness to your breath while walking, while sitting, while listening, and in doing so, you reconnect. Again and again. There is also a quiet patience that develops. When you stay with the body, when you stay with sensation, you begin to move at a different pace, not rushed, not forced, but steady. Because the body does not move at the speed of thought. It moves at the speed of life. And when you align with that, there is less urgency, less pressure, more ease. There is also a sense of safety that begins to grow. When you are lost in thought, the mind often creates scenarios, imagined problems, future concerns. But when you return to the body, you return to what is actually happening. And often, in this moment, there is nothing wrong. There is breath, there is presence, there is life, and this recognition brings calm, because you are no longer reacting to imagined situations. You are grounded in reality. There is also a deeper sense of being. When you are connected to the body, you are not just thinking about life. You are experiencing it directly, without filters, without layers. And this direct experience feels more real, more immediate, more alive. There is also a quiet strength in this connection, because when challenges arise, when emotions become intense, you have a place to return to: the body, the breath, the present moment. And in returning, you are not escaping, you are grounding, you are stabilizing, you are creating space. Space to respond rather than react. There is also a change in how you experience thought itself. When you are grounded in the body, thoughts do not disappear, but they lose some of their intensity. They are seen more clearly, as movements, as patterns, not as absolute truths. And this creates distance, and not avoidance, but clarity. You are no longer pulled into every thought. You can observe, you can notice, and you can return to the body again and again. There is also a sense of continuity, because the body is always with you, no matter where you go, no matter what happens. It is a constant anchor, a steady reference point. And in that constancy, there is support. You are never truly disconnected. You only need to bring attention back. There is also a deeper realization that begins to form. You do not need to escape your mind to find peace. You only need to reconnect with your body. Because peace is not something you create. It is something that appears when you stop leaving the present moment. And the body is always in the present moment, waiting, quietly, patiently. There is also a softening that happens over time. The more you return to the body, the less you are carried away by thought, the less you are pulled into tension, the more you remain grounded. Even when things are uncertain, even when emotions arise, you are not lost, you are here. There is also a sense of integration. Mind and body no longer feel separate. They begin to move together, in awareness, in presence. And this integration reduces conflict, because you are no longer divided, you are whole. There is also a quiet clarity that deepens. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of presence. You know what is happening because you are here for it. You feel it, you experience it, without needing to analyze it. And this clarity is steady, because it is rooted in direct experience. There is also a kind of gentle discipline in this practice, not forced, not rigid, but consistent, returning to the body again and again, not because you have to, but because it brings you back. It reconnects you, it grounds you, and over time, this returning becomes natural. It becomes a way of being. There is also a deep sense of relief, because you are no longer trying to solve everything in your mind. You are allowing yourself to feel, to be, to experience, without needing to control it all. And in that allowance, there is lightness, because you are not carrying the weight of constant thinking. You are resting in something more stable, more real, more present. And as this connection deepens, something very simple becomes clear. You have always had a way back to yourself. It was never far. It was never hidden. It was always here, in the body, in the breath, in the quiet awareness of this moment. And when you return to it, even briefly, even gently, something shifts. The noise fades, the tension softens, the weight lifts, and you find yourself here, fully, naturally, without effort, as you have always been. And as the body becomes a place you can return to, as the breath begins to anchor you again and again, something even deeper starts to unfold. When attention is no longer lost in constant thinking, when it is no longer pulled endlessly into memory or anticipation, there is a quiet realization that begins to surface. Most of the weight you carry is not coming from what is happening now. It is coming from time, not real time, but the kind created in the mind, the past that replays, the future that is imagined. And as you remain present, as you stay with what is here through the body, that entire structure begins to loosen, slowly, gently, until something surprising happens. Time, as pressure, begins to collapse. There is a strange kind of heaviness that comes from thinking about what has already happened. Memories do not just stay as images. They carry emotion, regret, guilt, longing. And when they repeat in the mind, they begin to feel current, as if the past is still alive. At the same time, the future pulls in another direction. It creates tension through anticipation, through uncertainty, through the constant need to prepare for what has not yet arrived. And between these two movements, the mind becomes stretched, pulled backward, pulled forward, rarely resting where life is actually happening. This stretching creates pressure. Because you are never fully here, there is always something unfinished behind you, something unresolved ahead of you. And the present moment becomes just a bridge between the two, a place you pass through but never stay. This is psychological time, not the time measured by clocks, but the time created by thought, and it carries weight because it never ends. There is always another memory, another possibility, another scenario, another version of what could have been or what might be. But when you return to the present, not as an idea but as an experience, something begins to shift. The past is no longer being replayed. The future is no longer being constructed, and what remains is this moment, simple, direct, without layers. At first, this can feel unfamiliar, because the mind is used to moving, used to thinking, used to staying active. But as you stay present, as you continue to return to the body, to the breath, to what is here, the movement slows. And in that slowing, you begin to see something clearly. The past only exists as thought. The future only exists as imagination. Neither is actually happening now. And this realization begins to reduce their power, not by force, not by suppression, but by understanding. When you are fully present, memory can still arise, but it does not pull you in the same way. It is seen as a memory, not as something that is happening. It loses its grip. It becomes lighter. The same happens with the future. Thoughts about what might happen can still appear, but they are no longer overwhelming, because you are not lost in them. You are here, watching, aware, and from that awareness, there is space. Space between you and the thought. Space that allows you to see clearly. There is also a deep sense of relief that comes with this, because you are no longer carrying the weight of time. You are not holding on to the past. You are not trying to manage the future. You are simply here, and in this here, there is nothing extra to carry. There is also a shift in how you experience problems. Many problems exist in time. They are either based on what has happened or what might happen. But when you return to the present, many of these problems lose their intensity, because they are not actually present. They are thoughts, and without constant attention, they begin to fade. This does not mean challenges disappear. It means they are seen more clearly, without added layers, without unnecessary pressure. There is also a change in how you experience yourself. When you are caught in psychological time, your identity becomes tied to the past and the future. Who you were, who you should be, what you have done, what you need to do. But when time collapses, even briefly, that identity softens. You are no longer defined by memory or expectation. You are simply here, aware, present. And this presence feels lighter, because it is not carrying a story. There is also a deeper kind of stillness that becomes available. Not the absence of movement, but the absence of inner noise. When the mind is not replaying or projecting, there is quiet, a natural quiet. And in that quiet, there is clarity. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of being. You are not trying to figure everything out. You are simply experiencing, and that experience is enough. There is also a different relationship with time itself. Clock time remains. You still move through your day. You still plan when necessary. You still remember what is useful. But psychological time, the kind that creates pressure, begins to fade. Because you are no longer living inside it. You are using time when needed, but not being used by it. There is also a sense of immediacy that comes with presence. Life feels closer, more vivid. Because you are not distracted by what is not here, you are engaged with what is. And this engagement brings a kind of richness, even in simple moments. There is also a reduction in anxiety, because anxiety often lives in the future, in what might happen, in what could go wrong. But when you are present, the future is not active, it is not here, And without constant attention, anxiety loses its fuel. It softens. There is also a release from regret, because regret lives in the past, in what should have been different. But when you are here, fully present, the past is not active, it is not happening, and without constant replay, regret begins to fade. There is also a kind of freedom that comes from this, because you are no longer bound by time in the same way. You are not trapped in memory. You are not driven by anticipation. You are simply here. And in that here, there is openness, there is space, there is ease. There is also a deeper trust that begins to form, because you begin to see that you can meet each moment as it comes, that you do not need to carry everything at once, that you can respond to what is present without needing to solve the entire past or future, and this trust reduces pressure, because you are no longer trying to control time. You are simply moving with life. There is also a quiet simplicity that emerges. When time collapses, even for a moment, life becomes less complicated, because you are not adding layers of thought. You are not carrying extra weight. You are simply experiencing what is here. And that simplicity feels light. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle. The heaviness you once felt was not coming from life itself. It was coming from the accumulation of time in the mind, the past, the future, the constant movement between them. And when that movement slows, when it pauses, even briefly, the weight begins to lift. There is also a sense of return, a return to something that has always been here, the present moment, not as an idea, but as a reality, as the only place where life actually happens. And in returning to it again and again, something changes. You begin to live here more often, not perfectly, not constantly, but more frequently. And each time you return, the grip of psychological time weakens, the pressure softens, the heaviness reduces, until one day something becomes clear. You do not need to carry the past, and you do not need to control the future. You only need to be here, fully, now. And in that now, there is no excess weight, no unnecessary pressure, no constant tension. There is only life, unfolding moment by moment. And as you rest in that unfolding, something gentle but powerful takes place. The burden of time dissolves, and what remains is presence, simple, light, free, exactly as it has always been beneath the noise, waiting for you to return. And as the pressure of time begins to dissolve, as the weight of past and future loosens its grip, something else quietly comes into focus. When you are no longer lost in memory or pulled into anticipation, when you begin to rest more often in the present, the mind does not simply become silent. It reveals its patterns, and one of the most subtle patterns begins to show itself in a way that is easy to miss. The need to complicate. There is a quiet discomfort that arises when things become too simple, when there is nothing to fix, nothing to chase, nothing to figure out. The mind feels exposed. It feels like something is missing, and almost immediately it begins to create something, a problem, a question, a layer of complexity. There is a strange habit in the mind that avoids simplicity, not because simplicity is lacking, but because it leaves nothing for the mind to hold on to. There is nothing to analyze, nothing to control, nothing to build identity around. And this creates unease, because the mind has become used to activity, used to solving, used to thinking its way through everything. When that activity slows down, when things become clear and simple, there is a kind of emptiness that appears. And instead of resting in that emptiness, the mind moves quickly to fill it. It adds layers. It creates questions that were not there. It turns clarity into confusion. This is not done consciously. It happens automatically, quietly, without being noticed. A simple situation becomes complicated. A clear feeling becomes analyzed. A direct experience becomes a problem to solve. And in that process, the mind regains something it is familiar with, control, because complexity gives the illusion of depth. It makes the mind feel engaged. It creates the sense that something important is happening. But beneath that, there is strain, because complexity requires effort. It requires constant thinking, constant attention, constant management. There is also an identity tied to this, the idea that being complex means being intelligent, that solving difficult problems means being capable, that having many thoughts means being aware. And because of this, simplicity is often overlooked. It is seen as not enough, too basic, too obvious. But simplicity is not lack, it is clarity. It is what remains when unnecessary layers fall away. And the ego resists this, because without complexity there is nothing to build around. No story, no identity, no sense of control. There is only presence, and presence does not require effort. This is why the mind creates problems where none exist. It takes something simple and adds meaning to it. It takes something direct and turns it into something to analyze. It keeps itself active because activity feels safe. Stillness feels uncertain. There is also a fear underneath this pattern, a fear of facing what is actually here. Because when complexity drops, when the layers fall away, what remains is often very simple, a feeling, a sensation, a quiet truth, and sometimes that truth is uncomfortable. Not because it is complicated, but because it is clear. It does not hide, it does not distract, it simply is. And the mind, in its habit of avoiding discomfort, creates complexity to move away from that clarity. It creates stories, it builds narratives, it analyzes, all to avoid staying with what is simple and real. There is also a kind of endless loop in this, because complexity never resolves itself completely. There is always more to think about, more to analyze, more to figure out. And so the mind stays busy, constantly moving, never settling. This creates fatigue, not from life, but from thinking about life. There is a difference between understanding and overthinking. Understanding is direct, clear. It comes and goes. Overthinking is repetitive, heavy. It circles around itself. And complexity feeds overthinking. It keeps the mind engaged without actually resolving anything. There is also a subtle satisfaction in complexity, a feeling of doing something, of being active, of working through something, even if nothing is actually changing. This satisfaction keeps the pattern going, because it feels productive, even when it is not. But when you begin to see this clearly, something shifts, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. You begin to notice when the mind is adding layers, when it is complicating something that is already simple, when it is turning a direct experience into a problem. And in that noticing, there is a choice, and not a forced choice, but a quiet recognition. You do not need to follow every thought. You do not need to engage with every layer. You can return to simplicity. You can return to what is actually here. There is also a sense of relief in this, because simplicity requires less effort. It does not need constant attention. It does not need to be maintained. It is already present. You only need to stop moving away from it. There is also a deeper kind of intelligence in simplicity. It is not the intelligence of analysis. It is the intelligence of clarity, of seeing things as they are, without distortion, without unnecessary interpretation. And this kind of intelligence is quiet. It does not need to prove itself. It simply understands. There is also a change in how you experience problems. When the mind is not adding complexity, problems become more manageable, more direct. They are seen for what they are, without extra layers, and this makes them easier to respond to, because you are not overwhelmed by unnecessary thinking. There is also a reduction in mental noise, because you are no longer feeding the constant need to analyze. You are allowing thoughts to come and go, without building on them, without turning them into something more. And in that allowing, the mind becomes quieter, more spacious. There is also a kind of humility in simplicity, a recognition that not everything needs to be figured out, that not everything needs to be understood in depth, that sometimes what is needed is simply to be present, to feel, to experience, without adding anything. And this humility reduces pressure, because you are no longer trying to master everything. You are simply engaging with what is here. There is also a deeper connection to reality, because complexity often creates distance. It pulls you into thought, into abstraction, but simplicity brings you back. to what is actually happening, to what can be felt, to what can be experienced directly, and this connection feels real, grounded, stable. There is also a quiet peace that comes with this, because you are no longer caught in endless thinking. You are not trying to solve everything, you are simply present, and in that presence there is ease. There is also a sense of freedom. Because you are no longer bound by the need to complicate everything. You are free to see things clearly, free to respond naturally, free to rest in simplicity, and this freedom is light, because it removes unnecessary weight. There is also a deeper realization that begins to settle. The mind was not creating complexity to help you. It was creating it to stay active, to avoid stillness, to avoid simplicity. And when you see this, the pattern loses its power, because it is no longer hidden, it is understood. And in that understanding, something changes. You begin to return to what is simple, again and again, not by force, but by recognition. You see when the mind is adding layers, and you let them fall away. You return to the breath, to the body, to the present moment, and in that returning, life feels lighter. Not because everything is solved, but because it is no longer being complicated. You are no longer carrying unnecessary thoughts. You are no longer building problems where none exist. You are simply here, with what is. And in that simplicity, something very clear becomes visible. Life was never as complicated as it seemed. It was the mind that made it so. And when that tendency softens, even slightly, everything begins to feel different, more open, more direct, more real, and most importantly, lighter, because you are no longer lost in complexity. You are resting in simplicity, where nothing extra is needed, where nothing needs to be added, where everything is already enough, just as it is. And as the layers of complexity begin to fall away, as the mind no longer feels the need to turn everything into a problem, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. When life becomes simpler, when thoughts become lighter, there is still one quiet habit that continues to carry weight: the need to be understood. It does not always appear loudly. Sometimes it hides in small moments, in the urge to explain yourself, in the discomfort when someone misreads you, in the need to clarify what you meant, what you felt, who you are. And beneath all of it, there is a quiet hope that someone will finally see you clearly, that someone will understand. But what happens when that does not come? There is a silent tension that builds when you feel unseen. Not always dramatic, not always overwhelming, but steady. A feeling that something is incomplete, that something is missing, and the mind begins to work. It tries to find the right words, the right explanations, the right way to present yourself, so that others will finally get it, finally understand, finally recognize you. There is a deep exhaustion in this process, because it never truly ends. No matter how clearly you explain, there is always the possibility of being misunderstood. No matter how much you try, people will see you through their own perspective, their own experiences, their own interpretations. And because of this, complete understanding is never guaranteed. Yet the effort continues, again and again, trying to align how you are seen with how you feel, trying to control perception, trying to be understood. This effort is heavy, not because communication is wrong, but because of the attachment behind it. The need, the dependence, the belief that being understood is necessary for peace. There is also an identity tied to this, the idea that who you are must be recognized by others, that your value depends on how well you are seen. And this creates pressure because you are constantly adjusting, constantly refining, constantly presenting, trying to fit into an image that others can understand. But in doing so, something is lost. The simplicity of being, the ease of not needing to explain, the freedom of not needing approval. There is also a subtle fear underneath this pattern, the fear of being invisible, the fear of being dismissed, the fear of not being valued. And to avoid that fear, the mind keeps trying, keeps explaining, keeps reaching outward. But this outward movement creates distance. Distance from yourself, because attention is no longer here. It is focused on how you are perceived, how you are interpreted, how you are understood, And in that focus, there is tension, because you are no longer grounded in your own experience. You are trying to manage someone else's. There is also a kind of vulnerability in letting go of this need, because it feels like giving up control, like allowing yourself to be misunderstood, and that can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. But when you begin to soften this need, even slightly, something unexpected happens. There is relief, not immediate, not overwhelming, but noticeable, a small release of pressure, because you are no longer trying to control how others see you. You are no longer carrying the responsibility of being fully understood. You are simply being. There is also a deeper realization that begins to form. Understanding from others is limited, not because people do not care, but because they cannot fully experience what you experience. They can listen, they can try, but their understanding will always be filtered. And when you accept this, something changes. You stop expecting complete recognition. You stop relying on external validation, and this reduces pressure, because you are no longer waiting for something that may never fully arrive. There is also a shift in how you communicate. You still speak, you still share, but there is less attachment, less need for a specific response, less pressure for others to fully understand. You express because it is natural, not because it is necessary for your sense of self. And this makes communication lighter, more honest, more free. There is also a deeper connection to yourself, because when you stop seeking constant understanding from others, attention returns inward. You begin to listen to yourself, to feel your own experience, and to recognize your own truth without needing it to be confirmed. And this self-recognition is powerful because it is stable. It does not depend on external feedback. It does not fluctuate based on others' perceptions. It is simply there. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this. Not the confidence of being recognized, but the confidence of knowing yourself, not through words, not through explanation, but through direct experience. And this confidence is steady because it is not dependent, it is internal. There is also a release from the need to prove, because much of the effort to be understood is tied to proving something, proving your intentions, proving your worth, proving your perspective. But when that need softens, the effort fades. You are no longer trying to convince, you are simply present, and this presence is enough. There is also a kind of peace in allowing misunderstanding, not because it feels good, but because it no longer feels threatening. You understand that others will see things differently, and that is okay. It does not take anything away from your experience. It does not reduce your value. It simply reflects difference, and in accepting that difference, there is less tension. There is also a sense of freedom, because you are no longer shaping yourself to fit others' expectations. You are no longer adjusting constantly. You are simply being as you are. And this authenticity feels lighter because it does not require effort. It does not require maintenance. It is natural. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle. The need to be understood was never about others. It was about seeking certainty, seeking validation, seeking confirmation of your own experience. But when you return to yourself, when you are grounded in your own awareness, that need begins to fade. Because you are no longer looking outward for something you already have inwardly. There is also a change in how you experience relationships. When you are not dependent on being understood, you can engage more freely, more openly. Without pressure, you can listen without needing to be heard. You can share without needing to be validated. And this creates space for genuine connection, without expectation. There is also a quiet sense of completeness that begins to appear, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer seeking completion through others. You are not waiting to be seen. You are already here, aware, present, whole, and this sense of wholeness is light, because it does not require anything extra. There is also a deeper ease in silence, because you no longer feel the need to fill every gap with explanation. You can remain quiet, not out of avoidance, but out of peace. because you are not trying to be understood. You are simply being. There is also a reduction in emotional strain, because you are no longer reacting to every misunderstanding. You are no longer taking it personally. You are allowing it. And in that allowance, there is less conflict, less tension, less weight. There is also a gentle clarity that emerges. You begin to see that your experience is valid, regardless of whether it is understood by others. That your presence is enough without needing to be explained. That your being does not require recognition. And this clarity brings peace. There is also a quiet strength in this realization, because it allows you to stand in your own experience, without needing support, without needing confirmation, simply grounded, simply present. And this strength is not rigid, it is soft, flexible, open. There is also a deep sense of relief that continues to grow, because you are no longer carrying the weight of being seen. You are no longer trying to align every perception. You are no longer explaining yourself endlessly. You are simply here as you are, and that is enough, more than enough. And as this understanding deepens, something very simple becomes clear. You do not need to be understood to be at peace. You do not need to be validated to be whole. You do not need to explain yourself to exist fully. You only need to return to yourself, again and again. And in that return, the need begins to dissolve. The tension begins to fade. The weight begins to lift, and what remains is a quiet, steady ease, a freedom that comes not from being seen by others, but from no longer needing to be. And in that freedom, life feels lighter, more open, more real, exactly as it is, without anything extra, without anything missing. And as the need to be understood begins to fall away, as the pressure to explain yourself slowly dissolves, something else becomes easier to notice. When you are no longer reaching outward for validation, when you are no longer carrying the weight of others' perceptions, your attention settles more deeply into your own experience. And in that quiet return, something surprising begins to reveal itself. The weight you thought you were carrying may not be as solid as it feels. There is a common belief that pain builds over time, that every hurt, every disappointment, every difficult moment adds something to you. That it stacks, that it accumulates, that the longer you live, the heavier you become. It feels true because the memory of those experiences is still there, because the emotions can still be felt, because certain moments seem to linger. But when you begin to look closely, something subtle begins to shift. The pain is not sitting there waiting, it is being recreated again and again. There is a quiet moment that often goes unnoticed. A moment where a memory appears, a thought about something that happened, a reminder of something painful, and almost instantly the body reacts, the emotion returns, the tension builds, and it feels as if the past is still alive. But what is actually happening is not the past itself, it is the remembering. The mind brings the moment back, and the body responds as if it is happening now. This creates the illusion that pain is stored, that it is accumulated, that it is always there. But in reality, what is happening is repetition, not storage. There is a difference between something being present and something being remembered. When something is present, it is happening now. When something is remembered, it is a thought, a reconstruction, a replay. And when that replay is believed, the body responds. The emotion returns. The experience feels real again. But without the remembering, without the replay, the pain is not active. It is not sitting somewhere inside you waiting. It is only present when it is brought into awareness through thought. This realization can feel strange at first, because it challenges a deeply held belief. The belief that you are carrying all your past pain with you at all times. But when you begin to observe your experience, something becomes clear. In moments where the mind is quiet, where attention is fully present, that accumulated weight is not there. There is no past. There is no replay. There is only this moment. And in that moment, there may be sensation, there may be feeling, but there is not the full story, not the full weight, because the story is what brings the weight. There is also a pattern in how this happens. Certain thoughts trigger certain emotions. Certain memories bring certain reactions. And over time, these patterns become familiar, automatic. The mind learns to associate certain things with certain feelings, and it repeats them again and again. This repetition creates the sense of accumulation, because it feels continuous, but it is not continuous, it is repeated. There is also a kind of identity built around this, the idea that this is my pain, that it belongs to you, that it defines you, and this identification strengthens the pattern, because it makes the memory more personal, more significant, more likely to be revisited. But when you begin to see that the pain is not constant, that it only appears when it is remembered, something shifts. There is space. Space between you and the experience. Space to observe rather than immediately react. And in that space, the intensity begins to change. There is also a difference between feeling and remembering. When something is felt directly, without story, it moves, it arises, it passes. But when it is tied to memory, when it is linked to a narrative, it stays, it loops, because the mind keeps returning to it. This is where the sense of accumulation comes from. Not from the feeling itself, but from the repeated engagement with it. There is also a kind of habit in this. The mind returns to certain memories because they are familiar, because they are known, even if they are painful, and this familiarity creates a loop. The more you revisit something, the more real it feels, the more it feels like it is always there. But when you begin to notice this habit, when you begin to see the moment where the memory arises, something changes. You can choose not to follow it, not by force, not by suppression, but by awareness. You see the thought, you recognize it as a thought, and you allow it to pass. And when it passes, the emotion softens, because it is no longer being fed. There is also a shift in how you relate to the past. Instead of seeing it as something you carry, you begin to see it as something that appears when remembered. And this reduces its weight, because it is no longer constant, it is conditional. There is also a kind of freedom in this understanding, because it means you are not bound by your past in the way you thought. You are not carrying everything with you at all times. You are only experiencing what is present now, and what is present now can be different, lighter, simpler. There is also a deeper kind of healing that becomes possible, not by trying to fix the past, but by changing your relationship to it, by seeing it clearly, by not feeding it constantly, by allowing it to arise and pass, without building on it. And in that allowing, the intensity reduces, gradually, naturally. There is also a sense of relief that comes with this, because you are no longer overwhelmed by the idea of accumulated pain. You are no longer carrying a lifetime of weight in every moment. You are simply here, with what is present, and that is manageable, that is workable. There is also a change in how you experience time, because when you are not constantly revisiting the past, the present becomes clearer, more spacious, less crowded, and in that space there is ease. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle. Pain itself is not the problem, it is natural. It arises and it passes. What creates suffering is the repetition, the holding, the constant remembering. And when that pattern softens even slightly, suffering reduces. There is also a kind of gentleness that develops, because you are no longer fighting your past. You are not trying to erase it. You are simply allowing it to be what it is, a memory, not a constant presence. And in that gentleness, there is peace. There is also a quiet strength in this realization, because it gives you space, space to choose, space to respond differently, space to not be pulled into every memory. And this space is powerful because it changes your experience, not by changing the past, but by changing how it appears in the present. There is also a deeper connection to the moment, because when you are not lost in memory, you are here, fully. And in that presence, there is clarity, there is lightness, there is life. There is also a gradual release, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. As you stop feeding the past, it loses its intensity. It fades, not completely, but enough to feel the difference, enough to breathe more easily. There is also a quiet realization that continues to deepen. You were never carrying as much as you thought. You were remembering it again and again, and when that remembering softens, the weight lifts. Not because the past disappears, but because it is no longer being recreated constantly. And as this understanding settles, something very simple becomes clear. You are not your accumulated pain. You are the awareness in which it appears. And when you rest in that awareness, when you stay present, when you allow thoughts to come and go without holding on to them, something changes. The past loses its grip. The weight reduces, the heaviness fades, and what remains is this moment, simple, light, free from accumulation, free from repetition, just as it is. And in that simplicity, life begins to feel lighter again, not because nothing has happened, but because you are no longer carrying it all at once. You are here, now. And that is enough. And as the illusion of accumulated pain begins to dissolve, as you start to see that what once felt heavy is often being recreated through constant remembering, something else becomes easier to notice. When the past is no longer being carried in the same way, when the mind is not looping through the same memories again and again, there is more space. And in that space, another pattern becomes clear. The constant conversation within, the quiet arguing, the endless back and forth. There is a subtle tension that exists even when nothing is happening externally, a kind of internal noise that continues beneath the surface. It does not always appear as loud conflict. Sometimes it is quiet, almost unnoticed, but it is always there. A thought appears, another thought responds. One part of the mind says one thing, another part disagrees. And without realizing it, you are pulled into this conversation, trying to decide, trying to resolve, trying to reach some kind of agreement within yourself. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from this. Not from action, but from inner negotiation, from constantly weighing options, constantly questioning, constantly going back and forth. Should I do this? Maybe I shouldn't. What if this goes wrong? But what if it works? This movement never settles, because there is always another angle, another possibility, another thought, and so the conversation continues, endlessly. There is also a sense of division in this, as if there are multiple parts of you pulling in different directions. One part wants something, another part resists it. One part feels confident, another part feels doubt, and you become caught in between, trying to manage both sides, trying to find balance, trying to reach a conclusion. But this process rarely brings peace, because it is built on conflict, it is built on opposition. And as long as there is opposition, there is tension. There is also a deeper reason this happens. The mind is trying to create certainty, trying to find the right answer, the perfect decision, the safe path. But life does not always offer that. And so the mind keeps searching, keeps negotiating, keeps trying to resolve what cannot be fully resolved. This creates a loop, because the more you try to settle it through thinking, the more thoughts arise. And the more thoughts arise, the more there is to resolve. There is also a fear underneath this pattern, the fear of making the wrong choice, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of not being in control. And to avoid that fear, the mind keeps analyzing, keeps debating, keeps trying to figure everything out. But this effort creates more tension, because it never truly ends. There is always another perspective, another doubt, another question. And so the mind remains active, constantly negotiating, constantly unsettled. There is a moment that begins to change everything. A moment where you notice the conversation itself. Not the content, but the movement, the back and forth, the constant arguing. And in that noticing, something shifts. You begin to see that the problem is not the decision, it is the negotiation. It is the constant engagement with thought. Because each time you follow the conversation, you give it energy. You keep it alive. But when you step back, even slightly, when you observe rather than participate, something different happens. The conversation slows, not because you forced it to stop, but because you are no longer feeding it. There is also a realization that begins to form. Not every thought needs a response. Not every question needs an answer. Not every doubt needs to be resolved. Some thoughts can simply pass, and when they pass, the need for negotiation fades. There is also a difference between clarity and agreement. Clarity is simple, direct. It arises without effort. Agreement is forced. It is the result of negotiation, and often, even when you reach an agreement within yourself, it does not feel stable, because it was built on thought, and thought can change, but clarity feels different. It is quiet, certain without needing to prove itself. And when you begin to trust that clarity, when you allow it to arise naturally, the need for constant negotiation reduces. There is also a shift in how decisions are made. Instead of analyzing every possibility, instead of debating endlessly, you begin to respond more directly, based on what is clear now, not based on trying to predict everything. And this makes decisions lighter, less complicated, because they are not layered with constant thought. There is also a physical change that happens. When the mind is negotiating, the body tightens. There is tension, restlessness, a sense of unease. But when the negotiation stops, even briefly, the body relaxes. The breath deepens. There is more ease, because there is no longer internal conflict. There is also a sense of unity that begins to emerge. When the mind is not divided, when it is not arguing with itself, there is a feeling of wholeness. You are no longer split between opposing thoughts. You are simply present, and in that presence, there is stability. There is also a kind of quiet confidence that comes with this. Not the confidence of having all the answers, but the confidence of not needing them. The confidence of being able to move without constant debate. And this confidence is steady, because it is not dependent on thought. It is rooted in presence. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle. The mind was never meant to solve everything. It was meant to be used when needed, but when it becomes constant, when it becomes the primary way of navigating life, it creates noise, it creates conflict, it creates tension. And when you begin to step out of that constant use, when you allow the mind to rest, something changes. There is space for clarity, space for peace. There is also a kind of freedom in not needing to resolve everything, because you realize that not everything needs to be settled immediately. Some things can remain open, uncertain, and that is okay. This reduces urgency, reduces pressure, reduces the need for constant negotiation. There is also a shift in how you experience uncertainty. Instead of trying to eliminate it through thought, you begin to allow it, to be present with it, without needing to resolve it instantly. And in that allowance, there is ease. There is also a deeper connection to action, because when you are not stuck in thought, you can act. Not impulsively, but naturally, based on what is needed now. And this action feels more aligned, more direct, because it is not filtered through endless debate. There is also a quiet stillness that becomes available, not because the mind is forced to be silent, but because it no longer needs to be active all the time. It rests naturally, and in that rest there is peace. There is also a sense of lightness, because you are no longer carrying the weight of constant thinking. You are not trying to solve everything. You are not caught in endless loops. You are simply here. There is also a deeper realization that begins to settle. The freedom you were seeking was not in finding the right answers. It was in stepping out of the constant need to search for them. It was in ending the inner negotiation. And as this realization deepens, something very simple becomes clear. You do not need to argue with yourself to live. You do not need to resolve every thought to move forward. You do not need to negotiate every possibility to be at peace. You only need to see the pattern and stop feeding it, again and again. And in that stopping, something shifts. The noise fades, the tension softens, the division disappears, and what remains is a quiet, steady presence. A sense of ease that was always there beneath the conversation, waiting, unmoving, uncomplicated. And as you rest in that presence, life begins to feel different, lighter, simpler, more direct. Because you are no longer divided within yourself. You are whole without needing to force it, without needing to think your way into it, just naturally, as you have always been beneath the noise. And in that wholeness, there is freedom. A freedom that does not come from solving the mind, but from no longer being controlled by it. A freedom that feels like rest, like silence, like coming home. And as the inner negotiation begins to fade, as the constant arguing within the mind slowly comes to an end, something very quiet starts to become noticeable. when the back and forth softens, when the need to resolve every thought is no longer driving your attention, there is a subtle shift. Not into more thinking, but into something you may have been overlooking all along, the silence between thoughts. It is easy to miss because the mind is used to movement, used to filling every moment, used to continuing the next thought before the last one has even finished. But when that movement slows, even slightly, something appears. A gap, a pause, a moment where there is no thought. At first it feels almost invisible, so brief that it seems like nothing. But when you begin to notice it, when you begin to rest your attention there, something changes. That nothing is not empty. It is peaceful. There is a quiet stillness that exists between thoughts. It does not need to be created. It is already there. It has always been there. But it is often covered by constant thinking, thought after thought, one following another, without space, without pause, and because of this, the silence goes unnoticed. But when the mind begins to slow, when the need to think reduces, even for a moment, that silence becomes visible, not as an idea, but as an experience, a direct experience of stillness. There is something deeply calming about this, not because it is exciting, not because it offers answers, but because it carries no tension, no effort, no weight. It simply is. There is also a difference between forcing the mind to be quiet and noticing the quiet that is already there. Forcing creates resistance. It becomes another effort, another task. But noticing is effortless. It does not require the mind to stop. It only requires attention. You begin to see that after a thought ends, there is a small space before the next one begins. And in that space, there is no problem, no story, no identity, just awareness. There is also a shift in how you experience thoughts themselves. Instead of being pulled into every thought, you begin to see them as movements. They arise, they pass, and between them there is space. This changes your relationship with thinking. You are no longer fully immersed, you are observing. You are aware of the movement but not controlled by it. There is also a kind of relief in this, because you realize that peace is not something you need to find in the future. It is already present, in the gaps, in the pauses, in the moments where the mind is not active. There is also a subtle fear that can arise when this space becomes noticeable, a feeling of unfamiliarity, because the mind is used to noise, used to activity, used to filling every moment, and silence can feel strange, even uncomfortable. But when you stay with it, when you allow it without trying to change it, that discomfort begins to fade, and what remains is calm. There is also a deeper sense of presence in these gaps, because without thought you are not in the past, you are not in the future, you are here, fully, and this presence feels different, more real, more immediate. There is also a physical aspect to this experience. The body relaxes, the breath deepens, there is less tension, because there is no internal movement creating pressure. It is simply still, and that stillness is felt, not just mentally, but physically. There is also a kind of clarity that emerges from silence. Not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of seeing. Without thought, perception becomes direct. You see what is in front of you, you feel what is in your body, without interpretation, without distortion. And this clarity is simple. It does not need explanation. There is also a shift in how you respond to life. When you are connected to the space between thoughts, reactions slow down. There is a pause, a moment where you can respond rather than react. And this changes everything, because you are no longer acting from automatic patterns. You are acting from awareness. There is also a sense of continuity in this silence, because it is always there. Even when thoughts are active, it is not something that appears and disappears. It is something that is always present, but often unnoticed. And when you begin to notice it more often, it becomes more accessible, more familiar. There is also a deeper realization that begins to form. Thoughts are not constant. They only seem constant because attention is always on them. But when attention shifts, when it rests in the gaps, the continuity breaks. You see that there are moments of stillness, moments of silence, and those moments are not lacking. They are full of presence, full of awareness. There is also a kind of freedom in this discovery, because you are no longer dependent on thought for your sense of being. You are not defined by the content of your mind. You are aware of it, and in that awareness there is space. There is also a reduction in mental fatigue, because you are not constantly engaged. You are not following every thought. You are allowing them to pass and resting in the spaces between them. This reduces effort, reduces strain. There is also a gentle sense of rest that comes with this. Not sleep, but a quiet resting. A stillness that does not require anything. And in that rest, there is renewal. There is also a deeper connection to the present moment. Because without thought, there is nothing pulling you away. You are here, fully engaged, fully aware, and this makes life feel more vivid, more real. There is also a subtle shift in identity. You are no longer the thinker, you are the awareness in which thoughts appear. And this shift is profound because it changes how you relate to everything. You are no longer inside the noise, you are aware of it. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this, because you begin to trust the silence. You begin to see that you do not need constant thinking to function, that you can move through life from a place of stillness. And this confidence is calm, not forced. There is also a deeper peace that becomes available. Not because thoughts disappear completely, but because they no longer dominate your experience. They come, they go, and you remain in the silence, in the space. There is also a sense of returning to something that was always there. Something that did not need to be created, only noticed. And in that returning there is familiarity, a quiet recognition. There is also a gradual deepening. The more you notice the space between thoughts, the more natural it becomes. The more you rest in it, the more it becomes your baseline, not the exception. And in that shift, life begins to feel different, lighter, less crowded, more open. There is also a realization that continues to unfold. Peace was never hidden, it was simply overlooked, covered by constant thinking. But when the thinking slows, when the gaps become visible, peace reveals itself, naturally, effortlessly. There is also a sense of simplicity in this, because it does not require complex understanding, and it does not require effort. It only requires noticing, being aware of what is already there. There is also a quiet joy in this discovery, not excitement, not intensity, but a steady, gentle joy. That comes from being present, from being still, from being aware. And as this awareness deepens, something very simple becomes clear. You do not need to stop your thoughts to find peace. You only need to notice the space between them, because in that space there is no conflict, no tension, no weight. There is only silence, and in that silence there is everything you have been looking for. Not as an idea, but as a direct experience, here now, always available, waiting quietly for your attention. And when you rest there even briefly, something shifts, the mind softens, the body relaxes, the weight lifts, and you find yourself in a place that feels both new and familiar. A place that was never created, only discovered, the space between thoughts, where peace has always been. And as the silence between thoughts becomes more familiar, as you begin to rest more often in that quiet space where nothing needs to be added, something else starts to fade without effort. When the mind is no longer constantly active, when it is no longer searching, comparing, or reacting as quickly, a certain habit begins to lose its strength. The habit of measuring. It becomes easier to see how often the mind looks outward, how quickly it moves from simple awareness into comparison, how naturally it begins to place one thing against another. And as that becomes visible, something begins to loosen. Because comparison cannot survive in silence. It needs thought, it needs judgment, it needs a constant movement away from what is here. And when that movement slows, comparison begins to fade. There is a quiet heaviness that most people carry without naming it. It does not always feel like pressure. Sometimes it feels normal, familiar, almost invisible. But it is there in the background of many thoughts, a subtle measuring, where you stand, what you have, and how you are doing, and against that, an image of someone else, their progress, their success, their appearance, their life. And without realizing it, your experience becomes divided, not just what is here, but how it compares. This division creates weight, because what is present is no longer enough on its own. It is being evaluated, judged, placed in a scale, and that scale is never stable, because it is always shifting. There is always someone doing more, someone doing less, someone ahead, someone behind, and so the mind keeps moving, adjusting, comparing, trying to find a place where it feels balanced. But that place never stays, because comparison is endless. There is no final point, no stable ground, only movement, and that movement creates tension. There is also a subtle identity built through comparison, a sense of self that depends on where you stand relative to others, better than, less than, equal to. And this identity is fragile because it depends on external reference. It is not grounded in your direct experience. It is built on perception, on interpretation, on shifting conditions, and because of that, it is unstable. It creates pressure, a need to maintain, a need to improve, a need to protect. There is also a quiet dissatisfaction that comes from this. Because no matter where you are, comparison can always find something lacking, something missing, and something not enough. And this keeps the mind unsettled, always searching, always measuring. There is also a kind of distance created by comparison, because attention is no longer here. It is out there, on someone else's life, someone else's path, someone else's outcome. And in that outward movement, your own experience becomes secondary, filtered, distorted. There is also a loss of clarity, because you are no longer seeing things as they are. You are seeing them through the lens of comparison, and that lens changes everything. It turns simplicity into judgment. It turns presence into evaluation. It turns life into a constant assessment. But when you begin to notice this pattern, when you begin to see how often the mind moves in this way, something shifts, not by force, not by trying to stop it, but by awareness. You begin to catch the moment where a simple observation turns into comparison, where something neutral becomes measured. And in that moment, there is space. Space to not follow it, space to return. There is also a realization that begins to form. Comparison is not necessary. It is not required for living. It is not required for growth. It is a habit, a learned pattern. And like any pattern, it can be seen. And when it is seen clearly, it begins to lose its hold. There is also a shift in how you experience your own life. When comparison fades, even slightly, what is here becomes enough. Not perfect, not complete in every way, but sufficient. Whole in its own context, and this creates lightness. Because you are no longer adding extra layers, you are simply experiencing. There is also a deeper sense of individuality that emerges, not as a concept, but as a reality. You begin to see that your path is not meant to mirror anyone else's, that your experience is unique, that your pace is your own. And in that recognition, there is less pressure, less need to match, less need to compete. There is also a change in how you view others. Without comparison, others are no longer benchmarks. They are simply people, living their lives, moving through their own experiences. And this creates space for genuine connection, because you are not measuring, you are not evaluating, you are simply relating. There is also a reduction in envy, because envy is built on comparison, on the idea that someone else has something you lack. But when comparison softens, envy loses its foundation, because you are no longer viewing life through that lens. You are simply here, with what is present. There is also a quiet contentment that begins to appear. Not excitement, not achievement, but a steady sense of enough. Enough as you are, enough where you are, enough in this moment. And this contentment is light, because it does not depend on anything external. It is not waiting. It is already here. There is also a deeper freedom in this, because you are no longer bound by the need to measure yourself constantly. You are no longer adjusting your worth based on comparison. You are simply being. And that being is not defined by others. It is direct, immediate. There is also a shift in how you approach growth. Instead of comparing your progress to others, you begin to respond to your own experience, to what feels true, to what is needed, and this makes growth more natural, more aligned, because it is not driven by pressure, it is driven by clarity. There is also a physical lightness that comes with this, because comparison creates tension. It tightens the body. It creates restlessness, but when it fades, the body softens, the breath deepens. There is more ease. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to settle. Comparison was never about reality. It was about perception, about interpretation. And when you step out of that interpretation, when you return to direct experience, something changes. Life becomes simpler, more direct, more real. There is also a quiet humility in this, because you are no longer placing yourself above or below. You are simply here, among others, without needing to define your position. And this humility brings peace. There is also a sense of returning to what is actually here, without adding anything, without measuring, without judging. And in that return there is clarity. There is ease. There is also a gradual release. The more you notice comparison, the less automatic it becomes, the less it controls your experience, and over time, it fades. Not completely, but enough. Enough to feel the difference, enough to feel lighter. There is also a deeper realization that continues to unfold. The weight you felt was not coming from your life. It was coming from how you were measuring it. And when that measuring stops, even briefly, the weight lifts. There is also a quiet joy that begins to appear, not based on comparison and not based on achievement, but based on presence, on being here, fully, without needing to be more or less than anything. And as this understanding deepens, something very simple becomes clear. You do not need to compare your life to live it fully. You do not need to measure your worth to feel whole. You do not need to place yourself on any scale to be enough. You only need to return to this moment, to this experience, to what is here. And in that return, comparison fades, the tension dissolves, the weight lifts, and what remains is a quiet, steady lightness, a freedom that does not come from being better or worse, but from no longer needing to measure at all. And in that freedom, life feels different, more open, more direct, more peaceful, exactly as it is, without anything extra, without anything missing. There was never anything wrong with life itself. The weight came from everything added on top of it. The pretending, the chasing, the resisting, the controlling, the comparing, the endless thinking, the need to be seen, the need to be understood, the need to figure everything out. And slowly, piece by piece, it was seen for what it is. Not something to fight, but something to release. When the false identities fall away, there is relief. When resistance softens, there is space. When emotions are no longer held as permanent, they lose their heaviness. When the need to control fades, life begins to move naturally again. When uncertainty is allowed, pressure disappears. When attention returns to the body, you come back to what is real. When time is no longer carried in the mind, the present becomes enough. When complexity drops, clarity appears. When the need to be understood dissolves, you finally rest in yourself. When the past is no longer replayed, pain stops stacking. When the mind stops arguing, there is quiet. When you notice the space between thoughts, you discover peace that was always there. And when comparison ends, what remains is a life that is no longer measured, but simply lived. This is what it means to return to yourself. Not becoming something new, but removing everything that was never truly you. And in that return, life does not become perfect. It becomes lighter. If even one of these moments felt real to you, not just understood but felt, take a second and share it, not for validation, but as a quiet reflection. What was the one thing that made you pause? And if this kind of clarity is something you want more of, subscribe and stay close to this space, because sometimes all it takes is a gentle reminder to come back to yourself again.